G'day, Mate 40 here. So I did my big interview with Nathan Cofnas yesterday, and it was something of a humiliation for me because you need to understand, I put over 40 hours of prep into that discussion. I wrote at least 2 lengthy blog posts critiquing Nathan Cofnas's last 2 Substack essays, and I had so many questions that I didn't get to, but I was so hyped for yesterday's interview that I just could not sleep the night before. Just tossing and turning. I probably got 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. I was just a wreck. And that's not infrequent for me. Probably on average, once a week or once every 2 weeks, I just get minimal sleep because I get so excited about ideas that they will just take over my mind often, and I'm restless, and I'm then wrecked when I can't sleep. And when I can't sleep, I have to reduce my bandwidth, right? I am much less able to respond nimbly to unexpected challenges. I just make my day as simple as possible. My judgment's impaired, and I was just an absolute wreck talking to Nathan yesterday. But right, you do the best you can, and I got to expand my views at length. If you want to read them, I guess I'll link to them in the show description. But Nathan has an interesting debate strategy. So it annoys me that I often see Nathan getting interrupted by the people that he's talking to, and it's like, Nathan, don't allow them to do this to you. But he has a rope-a-dope debate strategy, similar to what Muhammad Ali used in the George Foreman fight. And that is, he just allows the opponent to tire himself out, or the opponent to reveal himself in a way that's not terribly attractive. And so you see this with the Dave Green discussion over the weekend, where Dave Green I hadn't heard of him before, hadn't seen him before, didn't have any opinion about him before, but he was just so overbearing, so rude, so frequently interrupting Nathan. Well, Nathan holds frame, and Nathan comes off much better. And if you don't have an opinion either way about Dave Green, and then you watch him in his performance with Nathan last night, he does not come off well, right? He just allows... Cofnas just allows Dave Green to reveal less compelling, less attractive side of himself. Let's play some excerpts from this discussion over the weekend. Dave Green, the distributist, with Nathan Cofnas.
In the economy like we did.
Well, you think it's a bad thing that we became poor because because of NAFTA?
Yes, I think it's a bad thing that we became poor. Yes,
yeah,
Nathan.
it's a bad thing we became poor.
Statement.
And
it is a bad thing.
So Dave Green takes it as obvious that the median American became poorer due to NAFTA. And it's annoying when someone takes it for granted that the only serious position is his position, when the data are in fact quite complex. So the data suggest the opposite, that the average American became a little bit better off, but tens of millions of Americans were hurt by NAFTA. Tens of millions of Americans were benefited by NAFTA, and overall evidence from economists suggests that Americans might be slightly better off. But I remember on Book Club with Kevin Michael Grace, he assigned this book by some National Review writer who had an incredibly long name. This National Review writer just stated that the only possible position on whether or not the Nazis were right-wing is that they were not. That the only possible position is that they were left-wing. And this is a topic that's been studied exhaustively, and everyone with competence has recognized that the Nazis were a right-wing phenomenon, not a left-wing phenomenon. But to state that, this is the only possible position you can have, when in fact the data point in the opposite direction, or if the data are mixed, it's disqualifying.
You can't afford housing.
Do you agree with that? Is it a bad thing that the median 30-year-old person in this country can't afford a house remotely near the place where he works?
Hey, you got my friend Ricardo in the chat. He says, Nathan Cofnas has to be one of the worst possible choices for someone to obsess about. Just look at him, just listen to him. Nathan Cofnas has an extremely impressive body of work, and so that you don't see Nathan Cofnas as an Adonis, all right? That has nothing to do with the quality of his thought. Like, he could be in a wheelchair, he could have some horrible birth defect on his face, and that says nothing about the quality of his thought. Now, I do agree that physiognomy is often predictive, right? You often get a sense of someone by looking at their physiognomy. And so that this way of understanding life is often useful doesn't mean that it is universally applicable. And I think Nathan's body work stands for itself.
Look, there.
Is that a hard statement for you to make?
If you're making a factual claim,
No, it's a moral
look
claim.
at the data.
I'm asking you a moral claim.
Okay, so Ricardo says, Nathan Cofnas says anti-Semitism is a subset of the anti-white narrative, correct? Who is behind that anti-white narrative? It is overwhelmingly non-Jewish whites. So even Greg Johnson, editor of Countercurrents, points out that the idea of whites standing out for white interests is much more acceptable to Orthodox Jews than it is to your average white person, right? So the anti-white narrative is overwhelmingly pushed forward by non-Jewish whites.
Is it bad? Is it bad that median people have a harder time affording houses?
If the empirical claim were true, it would be better for people to be able to buy a house. Yeah, obviously. That's.
Do you contest the empirical claim is true?
Look, it's very difficult to make the.
So Dave Green is upset that Nathan Cofnas doesn't immediately accept that the median American is obviously worse off due to NAFTA. And he's upset that Nathan doesn't immediately clearly cop to it is more difficult to buy a house now than in the 1990s. And it is empirically obviously true that the cost of housing has gone up significantly, much higher than the average cost of inflation. It is more difficult for the average American to buy a home near where he works now than in the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, 1960s.
These comparisons, there's not a straightforward way to make these comparisons.
There's not a straightforward way to determine whether the median person.
What do you mean a house? People wouldn't be willing to live
house
in a house
near the place where they work, Nathan.
So they can't live in an apartment? Living in an apartment is not.
No, because if they live in an apartment, half of their.
So Ricardo says Nathan Cofnas is a shill for neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism? And I think most midwits would think that neoliberalism is a updated version of the left or of the center left. And in fact, neoliberalism refers to the free market, University of Chicago, Milton Friedman style. So neoliberalism does not mean an updated version of the left. Neoliberalism refers to the free market. And Nathan Cofnas is a strong believer in the free market. He is a strong believer in meritocracy, but you simply can't call him a shill. He has too impressive a track record in his academic publications to call him a shill. I strongly disagree with Nathan's last two essays, but it's not the disagreement that's important to me. I think that Nathan's last two Substack essays are a deviation from his track record of careful, precise, pointillist approach to what he's writing about, and he has now become sweeping and hyperbolic, and I don't think that that serves him. Whites are to blame. Get on with the times. Nathan wants to see more pale goyim in the cow pen. Less, I don't get that. Nathan Cofnas is incredibly impressive in some ways, and in other ways he's not impressive. Right? There are areas that I'm quite good. Right? I am quite good at interviewing people and creating a discussion among many different people. On the other hand, I do not have the charisma and the personality power of a Kevin Michael Grace to just dominate the room and to set the temperature. There are two types of radio broadcasters: those who note the temperature, which are people like me, and those who set the temperature, which are powerful personalities like a Donald Trump or a Kevin Michael Grace.
Or more than half of their paycheck is going to be consumed in rent.
You can
if you live in a, do you not understand this?
If you,
I hope. Well, pause this. You don't. This is the problem, Nathan. Like, you talk about not speaking French. Like, you're blind.
And Ricardo says Cofnas is basically high on his own supply. So I think Cofnas has done far better than most public intellectuals at navigating the perils and the challenges of the online personality. But unfortunately, to me, he is fixated on the idea that he should be able to earn a living from the selling of his ideas and his writing and his analysis. And that is the pitfall of optimists, the attempt to earn a living by the pen. Intellectual labor has almost never paid for itself. Intellectual labor is almost always subsidized, either by a university system or by patrons. So to set out to earn your living via Substack or Patreon is an incredibly perilous enterprise. And to try to surf the discourse to stay current and produce multiple Substack essays or live streams a week is going to come at a cost of quality. So I do not have Nathan's track record in academic publishing. So if I live stream every day, that is not coming at the cost of my stellar reputation for precise argumentation.
That you don't understand the problem. If you live like through your 30s in an apartment inside one of these major metropolitan areas like New York or San Francisco, like 60 or 7% of your paycheck goes to rent, which means that it does not go to your.
So I think for people who earn under $70,000 or $80,000 a year, it's true that more than 50% of the average paycheck goes to just paying the rent in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay Area, and New York.
Your wealth. If you are in the 90s and you have a similar median job and you're paying a mortgage, that mortgage is way lower than rent.
So are you saying
it goes to your actual family wealth?
You want people to be able to buy a house in New York? They can't buy an apartment?
No, I want people to be able to buy a house.
A house in New York? No, I don't think everybody should be allowed.
You mean buy a co-op? You mean buy it like in a co-op, like buy an apartment? It's the same story. It's the same story. These things cost millions and millions and millions of dollars. They're way outside of the price range of some.
I didn't realize that there are exactly 0 houses in Manhattan. I mean that they're all variations of apartment buildings and office buildings.
Who would be able to work a median job in the location? This is demonstrable.
I don't know. Look, there's a limited amount of space in New York. I don't think everybody who wants to live in New York.
It's the same story in every city.
I can't live in New York. I grew up in New York, but I don't think I have a right to just live in New York. I don't make enough money to live in New York.
Do you understand the overall systematic?
So you should have to have at least 10 or 20 or 30 law-abiding adults vouch for you before you are allowed to even enter certain valuable areas, such as, say, Beverly Hills, West Los Angeles, Manhattan, let alone live there.
Problem that this is not just a New York problem. You'll find the same thing in every metropolitan area. You'll find that the worker's median salary is significantly lower than the down payment they have on any property in that city.
So,
and you understand why that's such a big problem? Like, I'm just asking if you don't understand the parameters of this issue and why it's so significant to people.
So what does this have to do? The original point was that economists were wrong and therefore they've been discredited. And my procedure of appealing to a consensus among experts has been shown to be flawed.
Well, there's 2 statements of this. The first thing is you understand what's there.
So there are areas where you definitely want expertise. I would not want to fly on a plane that had not been designed by experts and built by experts and maintained by experts. On the other hand, experts have no great track record at predicting what will happen in the future with large numbers of people. Right? Economists have no great track record at predicting the next recession. Political scientists have no great track record at predicting future political trends. So Philip Tetlock did this massive study that showed that experts are no better than cab drivers in many areas of life. So there are certain areas of life where experts are infinitely superior to everyone else, particularly with regard to the hard sciences and to engineering. And then there are other areas of life where there's no demonstrable expertise in predicting the future, such as with when the next recession will happen, right? Economists don't have a better track record than cab drivers at predicting the next recession.
We're kind of going back and forth on this. When I narrow down and ask you the very specific question about the current state of affairs, like, we could, so here's a possible defense that you could make that you haven't made, right? The possible defense is NAFTA made us richer, but something else happened from the outside that made us much, much poorer. And so we're poorer now, but to no fault of NAFTA. But the claim that you made previously was that we are richer, that the median person is more wealthy now in real meaningful ways than they were in the 90s. And that's the factual, the fact that we can't bottom out on that is what stops.
So during the Biden presidency, the median American was steadily worse off. Most Americans were economically worse off. So there are areas where expert opinion is significantly, demonstrably inferior to the opinion of the average bloke. The average bloke saw that Joe Biden was significantly cognitively impaired, was frequently demonstrating signs of senility, and yet all the experts in the mainstream media and in the academy were telling us that Joe Biden was fine. The cognitive elite was telling us that Joe Biden was fine. The average bloke was saying he's obviously not fine. The average bloke was right. So there are times when experts have a great track record, and there are plenty of times where they're terrible. The average bloke was right that the Biden economy was not good for them. The experts kept proclaiming during the Biden presidency that the economy was great, and that people were simply too stupid to notice the economy was great, or that the Biden team had failed in marketing to the average American how great the economy was. But for the median American, all right, inflation was significantly higher than official statistics, and unemployment was significantly higher. If you go by the percentage of Americans who are looking for additional hours to work, right, we functionally had an unemployment rate of about 23% during the final year of the Biden presidency.
I made two claims. First, we're richer. Now, with respect to some particular goods, like the price of eggs, which people are very emotional about, the price of eggs.
People aren't particularly emotional, I don't think, about the price of eggs. It's that this one thing, this one category exemplifies a problem that they have, right? For the median American, inflation was significantly worse than the official statistics, because on the bundle of goods that comprises official statistics about inflation, for the median American, they were having to spend a lot more money than official statistics showed, because they were primarily struggling with housing costs and healthcare costs and other costs that were not a struggle for people who are earning in six figures. So sometimes official statistics are a very close approximation of reality. For example, if we have statistics that are based on death certificates, every advanced economy takes death seriously, takes murder seriously, and pays attention to death certificates. So death certificate-based statistics are highly approximate to reality. On the other hand, proclamations about the number of people who die from the flu each year are not based on death certificates, right? They are in part propaganda and the other part just guesswork. Now, the same government agency releases both statistics, the Centers for Disease Control. But one set of statistics is a very close approximation of reality, and another set of statistics bears not much relationship to reality.
This went up. Yes, we're paying more for,
relative to 3 years ago or the 90s. Remember, the comparisons to the 90s, not to 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
The 90s.
Now, I said that on the whole, we're better. Our standards have gone way up. We wouldn't be willing. Most people, the median person today wouldn't be.
So given that there are whole vast areas where experts have no expertise in predicting the future, right, we shouldn't be surprised that there's virtually no way to predictably earn a living in giving your expertise where there is no effective cash value for that expertise.
Be willing to live in the median apartment of 1970.
House.
But
90s, I said 90s.
90s, 70s.
Yes.
But I said that there is to the extent that there's a housing shortage, and in many places there is a housing shortage, it's because of state regulation where you're not allowed to build houses.
Right. So the more regulated the building situation, right? So in California, it's quite difficult to build new houses that will dramatically drive up the cost of housing, as opposed to Texas and the red states, which tend to be less regulated. So there is a greater abundance of housing, and it's easier to get married and to raise kids because housing prices are less formidable in general in red states rather than blue states.
And this is certainly
that's partially true.
That is partially true. This is, well, you must know that there are very strict laws about building houses in California.
No, I'm not contesting the fact that regulation contributes to it.
And that has nothing to do with NAFTA.
Okay, okay, fair enough. That would be the second.
I said that
stronger
10 minutes
point.
ago.
So you agree that the people are poorer now than they were in the 90s, but it was just
no, I don't agree. I said.
There is not definitive evidence that people are poorer now than in the 1990s, right? There is not definitive evidence that NAFTA has made the median American poorer. There is definitive evidence that NAFTA has had a negative effect on tens of millions of Americans, right? Vast swaths of the American workforce have been devastated by NAFTA. On the other hand, other people are able to buy more cheap goods and appear to be better off.
So we're trying to bottom out on the reality of the median person's life before we determine what causes it. Do you see how that's working? Like, before we determine whether something else caused it, we have to figure out whether this is something that's actually happening.
Okay,
if the median person is richer,
we could go through all the data, but my point about expertise and the consensus of experts.
Okay, I'll say this very clearly, Nathan. If the consensus of experts tells me that the median person has it better now than they did in the 90s, then I'm not going to believe the expert consensus when it comes to tariffs. It's that simple. I can see demonstrably through numbers that I have seen, and through just looking around. I know that's not scientific, but I can see through statistics and numbers.
Right. This is very unimpressive reasoning by Dave Green, not presenting any sort of empirical evidence, just making a bunch of assertions. It kind of reminds me of Z-Man's method of argumentation, which is the opposite of Steve Saylor or a Jared Taylor, or Charles Murray, who usually very carefully argue their case.
And this conforms to almost everyone's experience, which helps, even though it's not scientific, that the standard of living is much worse than it was in the 90s. So if the consensus of experts is telling me that we're richer now than we were in 1999, that like the median on the median person's experience, then and that's a verifiable fact because that has hard numbers. What's happening right now? That's a historical question. If I cannot trust the experts when it comes to discerning a verifiable historical fact, then why should I trust those experts when they give me a projection about what will happen 30 years in the future?
I mean, the economists were right, and they're right about the tariffs too, and so you'll see them being right again. So you can just wait.
The economists were right about what statement? The economists were
free
right
trade promoted the relationship between free trade and economic prosperity is as well established as anything can be in social science. There's a consensus among economists that tariffs are bad and free trade is good.
I work in machine learning. Okay, so this is how I do things. Okay, so let's say I have a system that's making predictions about the future, and I want to test that system. And I want to make sure that's A, accurate, and B, not lying to me. Machines don't lie. Well, maybe LLMs do, but machines tend to not lie. Let's say I want to make sure it's not systematically biased. What I do with this machine, and this machine is called the expert consensus on economics, right? What I do to test this machine as an expert in machine learning is I take a problem that I know
sports
in the country, and per capita, what's the denominator now? The denominator is per capita.
Right,
so
this is just hectoring.
People. So I was correct when I gave the definition.
So the number of dollars. It's not the number of dollars.
It's the dollars that are. It's measured in terms of dollars spent in the country.
So Ricardo adds the standard of living has obviously fallen. Just listen to all the different languages that you're forced to listen to at your local mall. So GDP is a very rough approximation of wealth. It's a very flawed approximation of wealth. And so quality of life has fallen in the United States due to declining social trust and declining social cohesion. Right? You go to a country like Australia or to many parts of Europe or to Japan, and you notice the average person in that country has a much higher quality of life than the average person in this country because they have much more social trust and social cohesion, and public spaces are much safer.
Measured by the government's records. It is in dollars. It is in dollars. It is the unit
Okay,
is dollars.
yes, it's in dollars. Yeah.
So it is a number of dollars then. Good Lord. Like, what is this? Like, you tell me I'm wrong. And I said this is exactly why I'm not trusting this thing, because I gave a more or less correct definition. You're telling me that I'm incorrect. GDP is dollars per capita, is dollars per person. That is the unit of GDP. Okay, great. Okay, so you think that the GDP per capita is a measure of median wealth? It is not.
I didn't say that. I wrote a whole Substack essay on this called.
Then why did you list GDP per capita when I asked you about the measure of median wealth?
I said it's a measure of the strength of the economy.
I didn't ask about the strength of the economy. The
It
question
is
that I
a
put
measure.
was
It
about
is a
median.
measure of. Okay, GDP measures the strength of the economy, which is related to wealth. It's not the same thing as wealth.
The question I asked you was not about wealth. It was about the median well-being.
Lesotho or Madagascar have a low GDP per capita.
So we will raise our GDP if we allow more people into the country. We will raise our GDP if the government spends more money, right? So higher GDP is a really poor approximation of a country's true power.
And America and Denmark have a high GDP per capita, and that's not unrelated to the fact that the second two countries are wealthier than the first two countries, even though GDP per capita isn't a precise measure of wealth.
Yeah, of course. So when you're comparing countries' wealth broadly, then you can use GDP to measure as a proxy. It is a very poor proxy longitudinally for the reasons that I just explained.
So in the middle of the 19th century, I think for most of the 19th century into the 20th century, which country in the world had the highest GDP? It was China. Right? China was an enormous country. Ergo, it was much more likely to have a high GDP. But Great Britain could send 7 ships and just smash China, because even though China had a high GDP, that did not translate to a particular, credible amount of power. So when it comes to survival, you want to be as powerful as possible, and GDP is not a particularly useful measure. Michael Beckley did a great essay on this, The Power of Nations, measuring what matters, right? You want to be precise. And when it comes to survival, and when it comes to world politics, all right, power is the most important variable, and general discussions don't accurately measure what counts for power. So people use gross domestic product, they use military spending, and they don't really get to what matters. They tend to exaggerate the wealth and military power of very poor but populous countries such as China and India. So what makes a country more powerful than another country, right? This is the most important question for the study and practice of international relations. And where I differ with Nathan Cofnas and the conventional perspective is that I believe that America's power, 99%, comes down to the power of its economy and the power of its military. It does not come down to soft power and America's a shining city on the hill, exemplifying democracy and all that stuff. Right? It just comes down to power projection and the strength of your economy. And people use really rough indicators such as gross domestic product. And what the heck is the problem with gross domestic product? All right, it's a very poor approximation of reality. So most scholars, most analysts, most talking heads, they measure power using these big gross indicators, such as GDP, right, which records the value of all goods and services produced within a country over a fixed period of time, tends to be referred to as the leading indicator, the Zeus of the statistical pantheon, right? But it's not that useful, right? It only counts production costs as output. So spending money always increases GDP, even if the funds are wasted on boondoggles. All right, China's wasting trillions of dollars. It's not making China more powerful, right? GDP is usually measured by the expenditure method, right? It just simply adds up all the spending done by a government, by consumers, and by businesses in a country in a given time period. So hiring workers always increases GDP, even if they're not efficient, even if they're just getting drunk. Boosting production always increases GDP, even if the goods rot on the shelf and tons of toxic waste are released in the process, which is what you find in China. You can increase your GDP by dumping toxic waste into the streets and then spending billions of dollars to clean it up. GDP does not deduct welfare costs. Money spent feeding people is counted the same as profits earned selling supercomputers on world markets. So populous countries like China and India, they generate a lot of economic activity simply by existing. And GDP counts security spending as an economic output. It does not distinguish between guns and butter. So you want to be precise.
Explained. The test question that I asked to test the veracity of economic experts was not to see whether they're a good truth-telling system. It was not can you report the macrocosmic wealth generation of a country. It was, what is your assessment of the median well-being of people in the country?
I mean, look, I guess this is a fundamental issue. I mean, if you think that under the guidance of the technocrats and the expert class, that life is just getting worse and worse, and everything was better and people often say that the 1970s was the golden age. You're saying
no one lists 1970s as the golden age, man. It's the 1950s, it's the 1990s. That's what usually.
Batya Ungur Sargon says 1970s was the golden age. She used that.
Right, different groups probably have different golden ages. It depends if your group is primarily a social class, if it's primarily a particular racial or ethnic or professional indicator.
It's the golden, and that was the high watermark of labor. That's probably what she's talking about, right?
So she said, this is Batya Ungur Sargon said, back in the 70s, the majority of the GDP in America was in the middle class. That's kind of like the golden era when the economy was really healthy, yada yada. Okay, so that's there are plenty of other people who've made the same similar statements like that. But okay, you say it was in the 90s, that was the peak. And that because we listened to economists that everything went south. Now,
I wouldn't say that. I would say that there are a variety of things that happened. But my only statement is that the consensus of economists, again, what I'm doing is I'm saying, how reliable is the consensus of economists? How do I test this? My test is I'm going to ask them a historical question that I know the answer to. That historical question is the median well-being of people.
And he never describes on what basis he knows the answer. So it was just supposed to take him on trust. This is a highly unimpressive measure of argumentation.
In the 90s, better or worse than it is now. The median,
well-being is a very slippery concept, right? So you can say, well, life expectancy went up and health went up and all these other measures and how much people eat and so on, all that went up. But you just want to focus, say, for example, on the price of eggs.
I could say,
so that was
no,
what Trump,
that was not the price of eggs. The price of housing was my primary.
Okay.
University needs to have a religion. That is critical. The institution does.
All right. I am not impressed by these inexact invocations of religion. A religion means interacting with superhuman beings or being, right? If you're not interacting with God, so to speak, or gods, you are not operating within a religion. Universities do not need a religion. Universities are not a religion. Leftism, Marxism, communism are not religions, right? A religion means interacting with superhuman beings or being.
Does not work without that. Harvard used to be a Christian seminary, then it became a progressive Christian seminary, then it became a, as you put it, communist, aka like progressive seminary. And progressivism is just another iteration of Christianity. And now it's woke.
So equating Marxist with communist is not accurate, right? Many people are Marxists who simply analyze from the point of view of economic class and material conditions, but they would have absolutely no sympathy with any communist regime that has ever existed. So Harvard has never been a communist institution. There are sectors of universities that are dominated by Marxism, but that's not the same as communism.
Which is another iteration of progressivism, right? Harvard has always had an ideology. The institution does not work without that.
For a brief period of time, I think Harvard and other American universities were fairly
What period of time was that?
Liberal. Let's say like 1960s to 80s.
The 60s.
Universities are diverse and enormous places, right? Even today, there are parts of universities that are doing valuable work, other parts of the university that are useless, other parts of the university that are probably antisocial.
60s, 70s, and 80s. That's when we created all of these departments that you're objecting to now.
Yeah.
All of
Yeah,
them.
but
They
the
were all
thing, in
created
terms
during
of
that time when you said that universities didn't have religion.
I said they're
absolutely
more
did. That's why they
classically
created these departments.
Okay, that's true. But in terms of what people could get away with, first, in terms of like the balance of Republicans versus Democrats at top universities, it was much more balanced than it is now. So there was a presence. And in terms of what people could get away with saying on universities, it was class. It wasn't perfect, and they definitely leaned left. But there was the right had a real presence on campus, and they had enough influence that they could.
Universities are the least nationalist sectors of America, and I remember this was brought home to me listening to my former UCLA economics professor, Russell Roberts, say that 50% of the reason that he supports free trade with China is that it's good for the Chinese. So the welfare of the Chinese is just as important to Russell Roberts and your typical university professor as the wealth of Americans. And also John Mearsheimer makes this superb point that there's nothing in conventional economic terms that account for balance of power politics. And trade shifts the balance of power. And the best way for a nation to survive and to thrive is to preserve as much power vis-a-vis its rivals as possible. But economics does not take into consideration balance of power politics, and it does not tend to have an orientation towards the national interest.
Secure.
Well, but because they had a bunch of old people there, right? They had a bunch of old people there. The conservative presence at Harvard were all of the old school people that still held the older version of the ideology, and the ideology was moving forward.
Right. So now, currently, 2.9% of Harvard faculty identify as conservative, and I'm sure they're all like
old. They're all old. I lived in Princeton. I lived in Princeton. I went to church and I sat right next to Robert P. George. Right. That is like, he's like the conservative guy at Princeton, right? But it's one guy, and he's like in his late 60s, early 70s.
So I believe Dave Green is a Christian.
Right. This is, or maybe he looks older than he actually is. But like these are the old guys. The old guys are the conservatives because they don't hire new people, right? And during the golden age that we're talking about during the 70s, that's when they created all of the woke stuff comes from the 70s. It was all created during this golden age. So
the golden age. It wasn't my term, but it was golden. I'll say it was golden relative to what it became, which is, I mean, there were whatever it was, like 1 out of 3 faculty were conservatives.
Elliot Blatt is making some terrific points in the chat. He notes that economic arguments are often messy, right? You can cherry pick certain metrics to bolster a point of view that you're advancing. High housing prices can be used as evidence of a strong economy or as evidence of a weak economy, right? High asset prices, high housing prices tend to be great for older people and terrible for young people. So I guess, yeah, Dave Green is a trad Catholic.
Or Republicans. I mean, it's, and now it's, Republicans are outnumbered at some places like 120 to 1 or 40 to 1.
But it's obvious why, like you can't get.
So there's a title of a book that I think is important for would-be professional intellectuals, and that is real artists have day jobs, and real intellectuals should have a day job. T.S. Eliot, I believe, was a banking executive. The American poet Wallace Stevens was a vice president of an insurance company. Right? Get a day job, and then do quality work in your spare time, rather than trying to compete to earn a living with your opinions, which will tend to reduce you to surfing the discourse.
Get into universities unless you're a progressive. Like you can't get onto tenure.
Yep, that's right.
Oh, so, but how do you fix the problem then? Certainly not by entering in universities.
Well, so I say there has to be a hereditarianism, and acceptance of hereditarianism has to be a part of an intellectual movement on the right that can actually compete for the elites. But otherwise, the only thing that we can do, if we don't have hereditarianism, the only thing we can do is what Trump is doing, is just try to destroy the universities.
That is the only thing you can do. What is hereditarianism going to accomplish? They'll admit it behind closed doors, and then publicly they'll profess they love diversity and
that would
inclusion.
take all the wind out of the sails of the woke. And
Why?
that is the source of their moral energy, is this idea that
Oh, they don't have to
society-
admit it publicly. Like they're just going to say, "Oh yeah, behind closed doors." Yeah, you're right.
even if it's
No, let's do
behind closed
diversity.
doors, the moral passion of the Zoomers and millennials stemmed from their belief that somebody from the Congo and somebody from Korea are born on average exactly the same, and it's just environmental forces that have caused one country to be, different from the other.
And so you must have tried this though, Nathan, right? You must have. I mean, I certainly tried this. You go to one of these Zoomers and show them, like Nicholas.
Right. Hitler was homeless for years. He floundered when he tried to make a living as an artist, and then he got into politics as a side hustle. That worked out better for him for a while.
Wade's book. Like, what happens to that? Oh, I guess I'm wrong.
So the discussion of the shooting of that Israeli-American couple in Washington, D.C. last week, I didn't hear anything that addressed what to me is the main point. If you have a Jewish state, everything that Jewish state does will then have an effect on Jews. So when Israel is at war, people will come up to me in the street, complete strangers, and they will weigh in with opinions much more readily. Israel at war will bring to prominence the Jewishness of Jews everywhere in the world. And while there are advantages to Jews in having a Jewish state, there are also disadvantages. Given that Israel's survival will always be precarious in that it is surrounded by enemies, Israel, if it is to keep on surviving, it will often have to make absolutely brutal choices. And when Israel makes brutal choices, that will then have repercussions around the world. So when Israel's at war, in a sense, all Jews, wherever they are in the world, are in a state of being combatants, because it doesn't matter how you view yourself, right? It doesn't really matter if you think, oh, I have no connection to Israeli policy. All Jews in the world are going to have repercussions from the choices made by the Jewish state, and a Jewish state at war and a Jewish state engaged in very difficult and brutal policies to suppress its enemy in Hamas, that will always then have implications for the standing of Jews around the world. So if the outside world doesn't reinforce our narratives, we're going to have a very difficult time sustaining our narrative. There are certain people in my Jewish community who are not big fans, and they do not greet me when I say good morning or good Shabbos to them. And it's very difficult for me to sustain saying good Shabbos to people who just ignore me. And I pass through the formal qualifications to become an Orthodox Jew, and I find places in the Orthodox Jewish community that welcome me. And if I didn't find places in the Orthodox Jewish community that welcome me, it would be impossible for me to sustain myself as an Orthodox Jew. I have entered group spaces and workspaces where I found a way to contribute and where my contributions were welcomed and respected. And that gave me enthusiasm to keep on contributing, and I thrived. I've entered other group spaces where my contributions were not welcomed, and I did not thrive in those workplaces or those group situations. So I may be more sensitive to feedback, right? I may be more emotionally needy than the average person, but I think we're all profoundly affected by how other people relate to our narratives. So Donald Trump has a tremendous amount of energy, and he has a huge bandwidth, right? He's willing to take on the Kennedy Center and Wall Street and China and Russia and Ukraine and affirmative action and 50 different issues. What gives Donald Trump so much energy is that he has a base that feeds back to him and appreciates him and notices him and applauds him. If he didn't have this fired up base that was responding to him, he would run out of energy. as Donald Trump becomes more embattled, more isolated, and less applauded, he runs out of energy, right? Charisma develops when a person does the seemingly impossible. They therefore attract a following and more resources, which makes it easier for them to again do the seemingly impossible. Eventually, right, charisma runs into a wall where they're unable to keep doing the seemingly impossible. And Donald Trump tends to run in energetic, manic, charismatic cycles until he has a string of failures where he becomes embattled, unpopular, and he's not getting the feedback of applause, which gives him the energy to keep going, right? If you are a star in your workplace, it's because there are all sorts of people that you're interacting with at work who are meeting you at a certain level and recognizing you and applauding you. And if you are fired up and energized in your life, it's because there are many people in your life who are meeting you in reality and applauding you and encouraging you. It's very hard to sustain energy, enthusiasm, and your most dear narratives if no one's feeding back to you on them, if no one's applauding you and saying, oh, great job. So there's never been as devoted a following for an American president in my memory as MAGA and Donald Trump. And that accounts for Donald Trump's energy, right? The greatest source of energy is your connection with other people, your ability to get on the same page with others. Your day will usually immeasurably improve if you have a positive 1-minute interaction with a stranger. The more positive interactions you have going through the day, the more energy you'll feel. On the other hand, when you get humiliated, when you realize that you're completely out of touch with reality, when you're not meeting people where they are at and they are dismissing you, denying your narrative, you will run out of energy and steam and enthusiasm and strength very quickly, right? Our greatest source of strength is the quality of our bonds with other people.
Virtually every Zoomer, maybe literally every Zoomer on the right that I ever met is full-blown hereditarian. It's common knowledge among Zoomers
on the right, though, right?
That wouldn't have been true of millennials, of older millennials.
Yeah, that's an important point. Here is Tim Dillon.
Consumed much of her content. My godson, who is 4, I don't think is a Miss Rachel fan either. I don't know. I don't know what he watches, but I don't think it's Miss Rachel. I don't know what's going on in that household, to be quite honest. But Miss Rachel has come under fire recently because she does content for children. Singing songs, things like that for kids. And Miss Rachel has come under fire because she's spoken out for the children of Gaza who are being starved to death and killed, bombed and stuff. And Miss Rachel, something's wrong with her, this woman. I think I don't know what's wrong with her. She's like mad at this. What? So Miss Rachel, yeah, I know. So this woman is like, doesn't understand like why all these kids in Gaza like do have to go, like all of them. She doesn't get it. She didn't get the memo that like these are not blameless children. They are part of a very, very dangerous terrorist organization. And they have to be, and I mean, there's people that are coming out saying this, by the way. Dr. Einat Wolf is outgoing. The Hamas represents the genuine desires of the Palestinian people. Another guy just came out, and we'll play him later, saying that, like, hey, there's not really anybody innocent over there. There's no such thing as innocent people. And so, and of course. So it's odd to me that Miss Rachel is not figuring this out. She's like just looking at these kids and going, why do we keep killing these kids? And there's always a good reason for children being killed. Oh, literally always. And it bothers me when people make it simple. Like, people make it really simple, and it's like the world is not that simple. When I see a child being killed, the first thing I do is step back and take a moment. I take a moment and I think about history, and I think about the layers and the complexity, the ins and the outs, and that's what I do. Miss Rachel, this dumb bitch, by the way, she sees a kid being killed and he's like, stop it, stop killing that kid. And I'm like, wait a minute, why don't you read a book? How about some study? When I see a kid being killed, I immediately open a book and I begin to read the book, and I'll find the answer. I don't know where, chapter 3, maybe chapter 12, but I will keep reading the book. I do a lot of this when I see a kid being killed. I do a lot of this. I do a lot of, interesting. What is happening? What is this? So she is, understandably ignorant of the need to, there's always a reason. We're not just running around killing kids unless it's a necessary thing to be done. Right? I mean, duh. So this whack job, okay, to make some political point, I don't want to see politics when I'm watching a children's show. Now, Miss Rachel is politicizing her children's show with Hamas propaganda. Let's take a look. And by the way, this is not for the faint of heart. I'm telling you right now, I watched this, I was in disbelief at how sick it is. I was in literal disbelief. This is one of the sickest and most insane things I've seen in my life. This is an American mother engaging in Hamas propaganda with a member of Hamas. She brought a member of Hamas on her show. Let's take a look. See if we can get a little volume there.
See the bunny sleeping till it's nearly noon. Shall we wake them with a merry tune? They're so still. Are they ill?
Disgusting.
Wake up soon. Or pretend to sleep. Wake up, little bunnies. Skip, little bunny, skip, skip, skip. Skip, little bunny, skip, skip, skip. Skip, little bunny, skip, skip, skip. Skip, skip, skip. Don't stop. Let's hop again. Hop, little bunnies, hop, hop, hop. Hop, little bunnies, hop, hop, hop.
This is Hamas propaganda. Let's stop this for a minute because this is insane. It is propaganda. Miss Rachel, with the a girl who lost both of her legs in Gaza. And again, you might think that's wrong. You might think that's wrong from the comfort of your house. You might not understand why it's right. Because, as Douglas Murray would say, you're in the comfort of your home. You're in the comfort of your home. People in the Western world, in your cul-de-sacs and your suburbs, don't understand why that girl's legs needed to be off her body. Do you understand that? Maybe you're confused. You better get the memo. You better get the program as to why that she needs to have no legs. But you'd understand that if you weren't so goddamn soft. See, everyone in the West is soft. And they can't understand why we got to kill children. They don't get it because they're too comfortable with their Chipotle bowls and their fucking, I don't know, whatever else they got. They're fucking, I'm trying to, here's the thing. I'm trying to think of like a regular mid-sized car, but I haven't had one in so long. So I'm trying to think, a Kia with your Kias. That's one of them, right? Yeah. The point is, everybody in our country is soft and doesn't get her out of here. Get this propaganda out of here, this Hamas propaganda. Elon Musk is out of the White House. I told you it was going to happen. I said it was going to happen. You doubted me. You yelled and screamed at me. The Doge era kind of ended. Elon Musk said, I'm going to save all this money. He said, I'm going to save $2 trillion. I don't know what they saved. A couple of pens. I don't know what kind of spending they even got to. To fight back against the forces that are trying to tear them apart. And actually, it's why our country exists. So before you get on your moral high horse, I want you to watch this. It makes me tear up. It's beautiful. From CBS Sunday Morning.
Antonio, a mother is charged with providing her son the means to carry out an attack on his middle school, and now both are facing terrorism charges. Janet Shamlian has the story. Details are disturbing.
Parents at San Antonio's Rhodes Middle School are asking why Ashley Rosalindo Pardo would allegedly provide her son with
Freeze frame on
everything
this.
he needed.
Freeze frame on this. I'm not going to have this mother attacked. No, I won't do it. I won't do. I'm not going to have this mother attacked. Mother is the most sacred and precious thing on earth, the mother. Okay? I'm not going to have this woman attacked. She is a mother. And I'm not going to have her attacked. And I'm not going to automatically assume, because her face is covered in tattoos and teardrops, that she's some type of criminal. I'm not going to assume, because she has purple hair and what may be considered gang tattoos on her neck, that she's a criminal. And I want everyone to give this mother the benefit of the doubt. I haven't even heard the details of the case, but off this photo, hello, Your Honor, the jury's reached a verdict and it's innocent.
To carry out a potential lethal attack on his classmates.
What kind of mother is she to be supplying her children with that?
A good
The
one.
boy, according to police, allegedly showed up at school Monday wearing a mask, camouflage jacket, and tactical pants, all provided by his mother, but then left shortly after. He was later arrested off campus. Police say the boy's grandmother reported him to law enforcement earlier in the day. According to an affidavit, she said she found him on Sunday hitting a live bullet with a hammer. He allegedly told her his mom gave him the ammunition and also bought him tactical gear. Investigators say before leaving for school, the child told his grandmother he was going to be famous. Later that morning, she alleges she searched his room, finding ammunition and an improvised explosive device wrapped with duct tape that referenced the 2019 New Zealand mosque shooting. Police say they've been aware of the boy since January, when school staff caught him with drawings that included a map of the school labeled suicide route. But when investigators questioned his mother, according to the affidavit, she did not feel concerned for his behavior, later admitting she purchased her son's supplies, including ammo, in exchange for babysitting his younger siblings.
Of course.
Jail records indicate Pardo was released Tuesday on a bond of $75,000. For CBS Mornings,
All right.
I'm Janet Shamlian.
I'm withholding judgment. I'm withholding judgment here. This is a free country. And she bought her son ammunition and helped him plan a school shooting because she needed to babysit. She needed a babysitter for the younger siblings. What about the dad? JK. But listen, I'm withholding judgment. I'm not going to run around and just to convict this woman because she did any of this. There are reasons here that she did it. There are layers. There are many historic, we got to put it in the context. Got to put it in the context of the history.
Okay, those were some pretty funny Tim Dillon segments. So, do we need to give more deference to experts? Should we have more experts around on podcasts? This is a discussion between Bo Weingard and Noah
To
Carl.
this debate on the right about experts, which has been raging for some time. It took center stage during the COVID pandemic, then kind of died down a bit and has now been reignited.
Yeah, and certainly in the United States with the MAGA movement, certainly hostile to at least status quo experts.
And let's bring Michael back onto the show. What's going on, Michael?
Hey, 40 boy, how are you?
I'm good. I'm blessed.
So I would like to discuss this Jake Tapper story. I know it's kind of old news right now, but, you know, it was news this week, right?
And we're classicists here. All right, there's no such thing as old news because we live in the world of Greco-Roman civilization. Right? No one is more Greco and Roman than us.
Yes. You know, and I have to admit, like, I'm someone that gets caught up in the news. I find it interesting. And then, like everybody else, I kind of move on to the next thing and forget about it. But in the moment, I get quite absorbed by it. So I heard you discussing Jake Tapper on Thursday or Wednesday of last week, and I agree with your take that he has taken on a humble tone because he was forced to do so, right?
Yes. He hired an emergency publicist. They're not called publicists. They're emergency specialists, and he was trained in certain talking points such as humility, because the initial talking points from his team was that he was a courageous truth seeker all along. but that didn't work. He got humiliated by reality, and so he was trained to say, I'm humbled.
Yes. And, you know, that's just the baseline is that the whole situation is very funny. It's like he wrote a book uncovering the mental decline of Biden and the cover up, and he was part of the cover up. So just baseline, very ironic, very rich with humor. But to your point, and I agree with your point, but imagine like an adolescent gets in some kind of conflict with someone at school and his mom says, you need to say sorry. And so the kid goes, okay, like, I'm sorry. And you can say, well, that apology, in my opinion, is not 100% genuine. But on the other hand, it's like, at least the kid had the moral sense that he has stepped out of line and now he's done the right thing and he said sorry. So do you take it at face value or do you question the kid's motives when he says sorry?
Most people just take it at face value because it's just simply easier.
Right. It's easier, but it's also just, I believe that when someone's in kind of like a defensive crouch and they're saying sorry and they're saying, I'm being humble, like he's self-identifying, I'm humble. So he is, by definition, he's been humbled because he's literally saying that I'm humble. And therefore, from my perspective, it's difficult to keep haranguing him when he's already said, I apologize to Lara Trump for that viral clip. Now, again, baseline is he's a dishonest partisan guy, and we already all know that. But after he already admits some degree of culpability, maybe not as much as we would like, I find it difficult to keep on hammering on the guy.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Megyn Kelly, though, did have a pretty good rejoinder when she was talking to Mark Halperin, who really put Jake Tapper to task, not so much for Jake Tapper as Jake Tapper, but as an embodiment of the overall media's failed coverage of Joe Biden's obvious cognitive infirmity. And Megyn Kelly makes the point that Jake Tapper's line, I'm humbled, doesn't feel authentic because it's so limited. So if you're truly humbled, it would extend and it would have ramifications, but instead it just feels like a publicist trained line that he trots out, and you don't see the ramifications of it, and so it doesn't feel particularly real. It gets the job done, so most people are not going to keep haranguing Jake Tapper or anyone who makes an apology, but depends how important they are to your life, or how much attention you give. So this line will work for most people. For other people, it will seem inadequate.
Well, I think the ramifications are basically a kind of public humiliation that he's become like the meme for liberal hypocrisy. And he's clearly seen that blowback on social media, which is like a beautiful thing. So I kind of feel like the point has been made and he's received the point and he's expressed some degree of contrition. And as to Megyn Kelly, I watched that interview and I just felt like it was a little bit over the top. And, you know, Megyn does a good job. She was very prepared, and I'm sure she did a better job than I could have because she was just like in command of all the facts and whatnot. But I almost came away with that from that interview, like sympathetic to Jake Tapper, and which is, you know, a very ironic place if you got me there because as I said, he just presented himself as soft-spoken and humble, and he didn't try to argue. And she really came in there with like a sledgehammer. That's kind of her style, right? You could have gone in with a scalpel. You could have made it funny. You could have used understatement. You could have used irony. But instead, she came off, her tone was a little sanctimonious, I say, with all due respect to Megyn Kelly.
Okay, I think this is, like with most things, the individual, his mileage will vary. I thought she did an excellent job, and I don't think she belabored her points. I think she made her points, and I think they were pretty strong and pretty convincing. Other people who are perhaps not as informed. See, he didn't initially go with the humble route. His book is not an example of the humble route. He tried to pull off that he was always a courageous truth teller. And his book does not acknowledge how he covered up Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline. He's only been dragged into the humble route, kicking and screaming. And so he tried to pull off a false front for as long as possible. And then only when he was repeatedly humiliated was he dragged kicking and screaming into I'm humble. But his embodiment of I'm humble doesn't seem authentic because it just seems so limited. It just feels like a line he trots out, and then some people will have your reaction and others won't. Pass.
Well, of course he's not going to admit his culpability, because how would that even work? Like a forward to the book, by the way, I'm a complete hypocrite and I'm not the guy that should be writing this. So I feel like when he does a limited hangout and he says that he could have done more and I'm humble and I apologize, it's kind of like a tacit admission that there's a lot of hypocrisy going on, even if he doesn't literally say that, just because it would just be untenable to do otherwise. And let me just remind people listening, like, I'm not a Jake Tapper defender. I just thought the criticism of him, or like the confrontation, just didn't work for me.
So what do you make of the fact that the cognitive elite and the academic elite and the media elite consistently told us that Joe Biden was fine? For example, I went through Google Scholar. I could not find one academic who cast any doubt prior to Joe Biden's 2024 debate with Donald Trump on Joe Biden's fitness, cognitive, and physical for office. Not one. Instead, you find countless elite medical academics signing their name to analyses saying that Joe Biden's just fine. You find hundreds of academics casting doubt on Donald Trump's physical and cognitive fitness for office. And so what do you make of the fact that the cognitive elite told us that Joe Biden was just fine, and your average American, including your average Democratic Party voter, said he's not fine?
I think it's outrageous. And it just shows you that, you know, the experts are sometimes going to lie, hearkening back to that big debate. But I guess I'm taking a long time to get to what my core point is here, which is that I don't think that the conservative media should do like a victory lap because they reported the facts about Joe Biden's mental decline. Like, does Megyn Kelly deserve a Pulitzer Prize in journalism for saying that Joe Biden is incoherent?
No, but I don't believe that Jake Tapper and Joe Scarborough were lying in the sense that they knew that they were covering up for an enfeebled president. They saw what they wanted to see, just like you and I see what we want to see. I know women who are as hot as F and as dumb as rocks. And I am strongly incentivized to think that they are much smarter than they really are because they are so hot. And so we all tend to encounter the world as we want it to be through the prism of our own desires rather than the reality. So when Joe Scarborough said in 2024, this is the best Joe Biden ever, I don't believe he was lying. I don't believe that his assertion bore any resemblance to reality, but I believe that it was the normal product of he saw what he wanted to see, just like the rest of us see what we wanted to see. So I don't believe that the elite media, including Jake Tapper, were knowingly lying. I think they saw what they wanted to see, and it just shows the power of desire to blind us to reality.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's difficult to say that someone is deliberately lying as opposed to deceiving themselves. And, you know, that's something I talked about in my channel too. I talked about Jake Tapper and I talked about Scarborough. Joe Scarborough, when you compare the two, I mean, at least Jake Tapper has expressed some self-awareness, even if you say that he's been kind of obligated to do so. Scarborough continues to maintain that, like, he had it right. Although I guess after the debate he changed his mind, but he's not backing down at all. But again, getting back to conservative media, like, and let me repeat, I like Megyn Kelly, but basically what she said to Jake Tapper at one point said something like a throwaway line, like, well, you know, if we stick to the facts, then, and you have no idea what he was going to say, but she just jumped in right there and she said, I have stuck to the facts on my show, unlike you. So again, very sanctimonious and probably true, but
I've
she
learned as a host to interrupt people when they say again, because we don't need to repeat the point. So conservative media, I think, deserve a victory lap in that they were correct that Joe Biden was enfeebled and cognitively not all there. They didn't do groundbreaking Pulitzer Prize winning reportage. They simply remarked on that which was obvious. Now, it's also equally obvious that different groups have different gifts. And that's not something that most of the conservative media will admit, even though it's as blindingly obvious as Joe Biden's senility.
Okay, but when I say again, I don't mean I'm going to literally repeat myself, but just I'm circling back to a previous area of explanation, which is that what Megyn Kelly did was she watched TV and then she just like talked about her impression of Joe Biden. So my point is just that like literally anybody, any anonymous right-wing account on X could have done the same thing and did. And so I don't find that conservative media, I don't find did like a particularly awesome job in the 2024 election, although I'm glad it exists and I'm glad that it's out there criticizing Democrats. But it was just this Biden is old was just the subject of so many like tired, repeated jokes. And then when you really like look into the content of conservative media, the way that they criticized Joe Biden was like, oh, he's not being tough enough on Russia, or he's not being like tough enough on the Gaza situation, or he needs to get, it was like basically just doubling down on like neocon, neoliberal talking points. That's why I find it kind of irritating that they want to feel vindicated because they made the most obvious point by literally just watching TV and saying, oh, he sounds old.
Well, sometimes saying the most obvious point is an incredible act of courage. You will have a very painful life if you say a lot of very obvious points about reality. You will be fired from your prestigious job. You will be isolated. Only one woman in 1,000 is likely to stick by you if you simply remark on things that are just blindingly obvious. So to the extent that the conservative media noticed and remarked accurately and honestly that Joe Biden was not fit for office, he was not fit for office in 2020 or 2019. From 2017 onward, it was publicly obvious that Joe Biden was not fit for any office of responsibility. No corporation would have chosen a Joe Biden type of person with that obvious periodic senility to lead them. And so that part of the critique, I think, was important. It just saying the obvious is a service, and many people will simply not have the fortitude, right? Maybe one person in 100 or one person in 1,000 will have the fortitude to say the obvious, right? You should not expect, for example, Asian females to have the same disciplinary level of problems as other groups. They are simply not as physically aggressive. Men are, on average, 10 times more physically aggressive than women. And to make that obvious point will get you fired from a lot of prestigious positions.
Okay, I mean, let me just circle it back, and then I'll hang up because I got to get back to a very difficult project. But so the point I'm making is more one about media in general, and then conservative media. So conservative media came in there and played a very important role in providing a perspective that was not available in the mainstream media. And in some ways, when conservative media grew and became more popular, it made the mainstream media redundant to some extent. I mean, it's still good, like you, I still check in on the mainstream media and see what's, the actual hard news. But conservative media played that role. But now we're kind of coming full circle where now that you have just anyone can post on social media and do their own kind of investigative reporting or just give their own take on the internet, on YouTube, wherever it might be, it's almost like conservative media is also becoming a little redundant. And when I see Megyn Kelly, who again I like, doing her thing, it's almost like I feel like she's just reading the news and just talking about it. And therefore, conservative media has become a little redundant to the extent that just independent people can do the same, but with more freedom and more panache and do it with a little bit higher level analysis.
Okay,
So,
here's where I differ. I think we profoundly need support for our narratives, and we need people who can articulate them better than we can. And so when you have a useful pundit, it's often someone who can describe what's happening in reality more pithily, accurately, and precisely than you can. So to the extent the conservative media can reinforce and articulate reality better than the consumer of conservative media, they're doing a service.
well, that I can agree. So we'll end on a note of agreement, 40. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. So I don't know if I am, I suspect I'm probably a little more sensitive to the need for reinforcement than other people, but have you tried sustaining a narrative for which you get no reinforcement? Right? It gives conservatives strength and energy and enthusiasm and optimism when they can find a media that supports and articulates, clarifies, and renders more precise their particular narrative. Our understanding of the world is largely socially created, right? And if nobody is reinforcing you in a particular endeavor, you are highly unlikely to continue. So there are some groups who do not find me amusing. And so in those groups, I don't make jokes. Then there are other groups where people say, I miss your jokes. And essentially, they want to provide fodder for me to go off and make my type of jokes. And then I make a lot more jokes. I make a lot more contributions. I give of myself more when people recognize and value what I'm contributing, and I stop giving and I stop contributing when people don't reinforce and don't appreciate what I'm giving. And so a news media that is able to articulate and more precisely render your narrative about reality is going to provide a service for you. So Edward Luce, I find generally a useless commentator, but he is the lead American reporter for the Financial Times of London. And this is what he wrote January 6, 2022. He's also a mainstay on Morning Joe. And he notes, on no topic is the bifurcation of America's media more evident than that of the president's age. To the conservative media world, Joe Biden's imagined senility is a staple. Republican figures routinely call for him to take cognitive tests. The term dementia is bandied about. And the conservative media was right. By contrast, the closest traditional outlets have come to addressing Biden's age as a spate of reports into the low ratings of his Vice President Kamala Harris. For them, it is as if openly acknowledging Biden's advancing years would validate the conspiracy mongers. And Edward Luce belongs to the mainstream media, and it was the conservative media who were right. Now, if you were looking at Joe Biden videos and saw, this man is obviously descending into senility periodically, but you're able to find no reinforcement for that narrative, you would probably be much less likely to articulate it or even to believe in it less strongly, right? It was Edward Luce and the mainstream media who were checked out of reality with regard to Joe Biden's senility. And now it's Edward Luce who's been making the rounds, including on the Elite Morning Joe TV show, pronouncing on the Joe Biden senility story without admitting how wrong he was. And that's the precise angle that Jake Tapper tried to take until he could not do it any longer.
We're only 48 hours past your interview with Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson and the release of their book. One of the things I tell anchors who I work with or young people who want to be in TV, a list of questions is not a strategy. If you're doing an interview, you need a strategy. What was your strategy when you were interviewing Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson?
Well, I did go back and forth on how should I start it. Should I start it by getting into the facts of the book, or should I start it by really pushing him on whether he's the right messenger? And in the end, it just didn't feel like I knew I had to get to pushing him on whether he's the right messenger. That could not be sacrificed. We only had we had 1 hour plus 14 minutes with him, 1 hour with some breaks plus 14 minutes. And so I just that was the priority. Get to that, and then whatever time we had left, I would do the substance of the book in, and so that made sense to me. And then there was a question of how hard should I push him, because we are friends. We're not like tight friends, but we're friends. We've been friendly, I guess is a better way of saying it, for some 15 years now. I've never done anything social with Jake, but we like each other. So it was kind of awkward, you know. I think he knew, because in the booking process, he and I had been in touch, that I was going to push him. And he told me before the interview he wanted that because he wanted to answer the tough questions for all of his skeptics. So I felt like we were on a good ground for me to go for it. Maybe it was like an 8.5 when he thought it might be a 6.5. I'm not sure. I think we're fine, but you know how it is. It's like you have to go with the flow when the person comes on and see if they're pushing back, if they're giving it up. You know, if he had rolled over more right at the top, it wouldn't have been as contentious as it got.
Right. We were going to play a 2-minute soundbite from the interview, but I'm told anything longer than a minute's a bad idea, so we won't.
I mean, to be honest, I do make exceptions. It depends.
All right. Maybe we'll roll in something here, 2 minutes or so.
Megyn,
Well, that's
Megyn,
what happened. Go ahead.
if we're going to do this, let's just stick to the facts here, okay? When there is a damaging
Jake,
report,
that's what I've been doing all along.
I'm
One
talking
of
about
us
what you just said.
didn't miss the biggest story of the century when it comes to presidential politics, and one of us did.
If you hadn't done the interview and Jake, as your friend, called you afterwards and said, hey, how'd I do with that interviewer? How would you say Jake did in his interview with you?
Well, I'll be totally honest. I thought he could have done better. Jake, when he's more relaxed, is much more conversational. And I thought in our interview, he sounded almost affected a bit, you know, like almost like he was trying to be professorial and maintain his cool. And he kept repeating that thing. I look back on my coverage with humility, which sounded PR tested and not really authentic.
There's a reason it sounded PR tested.
Yeah, I know. And I just think like that's the problem. It's not just Jake's problem. It's a problem with
Jake Tapper hired a crisis management expert, right? They don't like to be called publicists, but he hired a crisis management expert who gave him the line, I feel humbled.
a lot of people who are stuck in the cable news universe, which is they're not their authentic selves when they're on camera. You know, Jake is actually a pretty relaxed guy in your personal interactions with him. I do like him. It's just on camera, not everybody can do it. And when they're feeling on their heels, not everybody can do it. He would have been much better served by just completely owning, I'm embarrassed right up top, and putting it in his own words so he could really fill it out and convince people of it.
How convincing do you find his argument that he acknowledges he missed the story, but that there was no way for him to actually get the story?
I don't believe it. I don't believe that. I think he did have the sources, and I just think everyone went along because they liked the lie. They were perfectly happy with the lie. You know, Jake is articulating it perfectly now about how Trump was viewed as an existential threat, and when that's how you see your opponent, many means are justified. Except he's still not admitting he was part of that. And that, like, he talked about how he didn't see what Laura Trump saw, what I saw, what you saw. And one question I wish I had asked him was, why not? Have you spent any time trying to figure out why you didn't see it? Because I would say
the best answer to that is you cannot accurately describe reality without violating the precepts of political correctness and elite discourse. Unless you're willing to violate those precepts and to pay the price for violating those precepts, you cannot accurately describe reality, right? Thousands of people want to be heroic, right? Thousands of people want to tell tough truths, but only 1% or 0.1% of people have the fortitude and the strength to stand up when they then receive criticism, even what they regard as unfair criticism. So we had a bloke on Substack who just got outed by Hope Not Hate, right? He unmasked Morgoth, the British influencer who supposedly inspired a terrorist. And so we've got Morgoth firing back on Substack about how unfair this unmasking was by Hope Not Hate. And Steve Saylor's publisher, Jonathan Kieferman, was lamenting when he got outed, doxed by The Guardian, and how unfair it was. But you want to be a player, right? You want to influence national politics. You want to make hundreds of posts online about controversial, edgy issues, but you don't want to pay any price for it. That's not realistic. All right. Don't do the social crime if you're not willing to pay the price, and don't bemoan being doxxed when you were publicly trying to shape national politics, right? When you try to become a player and you see yourself in a heroic role, then don't be surprised that there's a pushback. Now, if you have no effect and therefore there's no incentive for people to push back against you, right, you're much less likely to get targeted. But people engage in public campaigns because they want to change the world. They want to change the nation. They want to change discourse. And you should expect to be outed. And you should expect to be the recipient of unfair criticism. And unless you have the fortitude to handle that, don't play the game. And then don't complain about unfair criticism. Don't complain about being identified if you want to join the public conversation.
Claim about Rogan's failing to have enough experts on, or platforming people who aren't experts, is, at least ideally, these are not people who necessarily agree with Murray, but rather they're people who have the requisite knowledge to speak intelligently about these topics, right? And I gather that, so some people wrote defenses of Murray in his claim about experts, including our friend Nate Cofnas and others. I gather.
And Bob writes in the chat, did the right-wing media fail for not outing Biden from the presidency? No, media doesn't fail if they're not able to accomplish significant real-world changes. The right-wing media did a much better job than the mainstream media in pointing out that it was perilous and even outrageous that Joe Biden remained in the presidency when he was simply too frail to do the job. So the mainstream media moved on from the Joe Biden obvious senility angle story as soon as it possibly could, and it instead embraced Kamala Harris and tried to push her narratives. Right-wing media did a better job at raising questions. Why should Biden still be president?
You're more skeptical, at least you seem more skeptical, of perhaps both of political expertise and of our ability to ascertain what a political expert would be. And you are also therefore more lenient, I guess, or more tolerant of a wide diversity of views, including those who would be considered, or those views that would be considered conspiratorial.
That's
Is that
right.
correct?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess, like, can you defend those or state those?
Believes oughtn't to have the platform they've managed to accrue for themselves, have made various factual errors, in some cases perhaps quite egregious ones, that their opinions on subjects like the Ukraine war and Israel-Palestine are maybe outside of, or maybe considered fringe, although that can be debated. And he and in particular he accused Smith, his debate opponent, of talking excessively about Israel-Palestine in particular, despite not having expertise in that subject, and indeed admitting to not being an expert on that subject.
Correct.
And both Kissin and Cofnas
Right, so Konstantin Kissin, Nathan Cofnas, and other pro-Douglas Murray voices take it for granted that Douglas Murray has expertise with regard to the Middle East, and he doesn't, right? He is not an impressive scholar. He's not a disinterested pursuer of truth. He is a predictable partisan pundit. He's a hack. And if you optimize for truth, you shouldn't be wasting time with Douglas Murray or the All In podcast or Ben Shapiro and the ilk, because these are not people who have a disinterested optimization for truth. And taking it for granted that Douglas Murray is particularly qualified to speak on the subjects he talks about is ridiculous. Right? So Nathan Cofnas characterized Douglas Murray as someone who went to Oxford, writes books with footnotes, and hangs out with academics. And this is in contrast to Dave Smith, who gets basic facts wrong in ways that reveal deep ignorance and intellectual irresponsibility. Now, Dave Smith has made many embarrassing errors. Dave Smith is primarily a comic, and Douglas Murray is primarily a partisan pundit who is, always reliably making the same arguments for the same side. And the errors that Douglas Murray makes with regard to the Middle East and other topics are no less egregious than Dave Smith, the comic. right? So Douglas Murray uses fabricated quotes and anonymous Twitter accounts as his footnote, right? When that's your footnote for a source, that shows that you have, pretty poor epistemics. Douglas Murray makes many false or misleading statements regarding his debate with Dave Smith. He stated the previous guest on Joe Rogan's podcast had very carefully tried to minimize the evil of Adolf Hitler, but that guest didn't even mention Hitler. And then the arguments that Douglas Murray put forward in his debate with Dave Smith were ridiculous. And the first one was particularly absurd. He says, if you're going to spend a year and a half talking about a place, you should at least do the courtesy of visiting it, right? This is not a serious argument, right? Douglas Murray is constantly talking about countries he's never been to, right? And countless people have visited Israel, Palestine, and they almost always come away from the visit with the exact same point of view that they took into the visit, right? So Douglas Murray accused Dave Smith of appeal to authority when he simply quotes the former head of the CIA, right? This is not what appeal to authority means. An appeal to authority is where you argue, I am right because such and such an authority figure says so, right? Merely citing a diplomatic cable as evidence to support a point of view is not making an appeal to authority, right? If Douglas Murray were correct, it'd be logically fallacious to ever cite evidence or a diplomatic cable in an argument, which would rule out entire scholarly disciplines. And Douglas Murray published in the New York Post that Dave Smith is someone who claims to have some Jewish ancestry, right? Dave Smith has confirmed both his parents are Jewish, and by genetics, he's 84% Ashkenazi Jew. Now, this doesn't mean that Douglas Murray should not be allowed on podcasts, but there's absolutely no empirical, logical, scholarly reason to think that Douglas Murray is of a higher intellectual or scholarly or optimizing for truth character than Dave Smith.
In the articles that they wrote.
Konstantin Kissis, right?
Konstantin Kissin, who's a very prominent commentator on social media, who I know and like personally.
Yeah.
And they both pointed out that there have been demonstrable mistakes made by the targets of Murray's criticism, and I wouldn't necessarily dispute this most or at least some of the specific points they made. But what I said in the article is that Murray has also made, it seems, quite serious mistakes, or at least mistakes of a comparable sort to the ones made by, for example, Smith.
Right.
And I cite, there was this recent review that went viral on Twitter of Murray's new book, which pointed out a number of factual errors and misleading claims in the book. We don't need to go over those because that's not the main point of the discussion. But in addition...
So Nathan Robinson is a man of the left, and he penned a scathing review of Douglas Murray's new book. And one reason it is valuable to listen to the smartest people on the other side of the political spectrum from yourself is that they have much less inhibition about describing the nonsense on your side of the political spectrum. So I forgot how ridiculous is it that bloke for the Hoover Institute who hosts all, is it Nathan Robinson who hosts all those interviews, how subservient he makes himself, just all the ridiculous things he says, which I've encountered on numerous occasions, but never thought to remark on. But when Decoding the Gurus remarked on how ridiculous he is, it's like, oh yeah, but I didn't think about it because, what's his name at Hoover Institute who does the interviews, right? Former Reagan speechwriter, right? Because he was on my side. I didn't think think to remark on the obvious absurdity.
Three of the most accomplished historians of our time, or any time: Neil Ferguson, Victor Davis Hanson, and Andrew Roberts on Uncommon Knowledge now.
All right, just nonsense. Peter Robinson. All right, just Neil Ferguson, Victor Davis Hanson, and neither of those two are particularly highly accomplished historians. Right, they're popular on the right. I don't know what Andrew Roberts' scholarly standing is, but to think that Neil Ferguson and Victor Davis Hanson are somehow respected historians on the pure scholarly basis of their work, I know that is not true. they're useful for people on the right because they have, right-wing talking points. And it was by listening to scathing critique from Decoding the Gurus, I said, oh yeah, Peter Robinson, is a buffoon. It is ridiculous the way that he puffs up his guests. And I just listened to Decoding the Gurus take down the All In podcast. And it's like, oh yeah, there is very little of value in the All In podcast, right? It's a bunch of billionaires making varying degrees of Trump-friendly opinions.
And this is the reason why the podcast on Joe Rogan went completely viral. He made a number of what I regard as extremely bizarre.
Yeah, Peter Robinson does get good guests, and like Alex Coulter, right? She often gets good guests, but their questions for both of them are just so bad often. They're just so meandering. There's just so much subservient puffing up of the guest. It's completely worthy of ridicule.
Arguments. So these weren't factual claims, but modes of reasoning in the discussion with Smith. And the one that really got people's attention was where he claimed that he expressed shock and amusement that Smith had never been to Israel, Palestine, or even to the region.
Yes.
Now, I personally think this is an extremely bad argument. And obviously, a lot of other people on the internet did as well, as evidenced by the...
So I am largely sympathetic to Peter Robinson's worldview, to Douglas Murray's worldview, to Ben Shapiro's worldview, to Dennis Prager's worldview, but these are not impressive intellectuals or scholars. They just simply feed back to me my pre-existing worldview.
The overwhelming negative reaction to this argument. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that just because a lot of people agree with me, I'm right.
Right, but just to interject really quickly. So Murray's argument seemed to be that if you hadn't traveled to the region, you could not talk publicly about it, or you should at least refrain from talking publicly about it. And indeed, I think he said something like, it's my journalistic practice not to talk about countries that I've never visited, or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's what he said, and that's more or less what he was arguing.
So this seems to be
this isn't a...
So I notice in myself, I tend to always reframe things in a way that makes myself look best. And when I have a dispute, argument, conflict with someone else, my mind immediately starts working in a way that reframes it so that I'm right. And when I encounter punditry, it sure seems like for the overwhelming number of pundits that I encounter, their primary frame of reference is to advance themselves, not to pursue truth.
Straw man. I mean, he did state that quite.
That's correct. So he made I guess we could call this a standpoint epistemology claim that you have to have visited the area, so that if I want to talk about some conflict in West Virginia, I should go to West Virginia. Otherwise, I should refrain from talking about it publicly. It seems to be what he's saying.
I mean, he didn't necessarily go quite as far as to say you should completely refrain, but he did express bemusement that someone would talk a lot about something without having been to the relevant country. And
I would say, there was like palpable outrage where he expressed.
Bordered on outrage.
Yeah, if you get on your high horse and make pronouncements filled with outrage on a ridiculous basis, such as what Dave Green does, and I'm sure I've done, you just appear like a buffoon.
Yeah, it's perhaps a little condescending, like, you can't be serious, you haven't been there, oh my God. Yes.
And in Kissin's article, he actually defends this argument from Murray. Cofnas...
Right, Konstantin Kissin, another partisan hack.
Doesn't defend it, from what I recall. But Kissin does, and he basically says that all Murray really meant was, you can learn about something if you see it with your own eyes, which I think is not a fair characterization of the argument.
So banal as to be worthless, and also not what Murray said.
I mean, Murray went much further than that. If he just said, by the way, Dave Smith, all else being equal, you might gain a little bit of perspective if you wanted to visit the particular places we've been talking about. Right. He didn't say that.
Yes.
Right, getting on your high horse and speaking down to people just almost never serves you in a debate.
So I was I was actually shocked that the people defended this argument after the podcast was published.
Right, you would only defend that argument if you were just enthralled to having your own hero system reinforced.
Assumed Murray was going to come out and say, yeah, okay, I mean, I stand by all my positions, but that, that particular argument I made was not the best. But he doubled down.
Yes.
And this is in spite of the fact that, as numerous people pointed out, he frequently talks about countries he's never been to, such as Iran. And now, interestingly, Kissin, when I had a polite exchange with him on social media, said, well, that's because Murray can't get a visa for Iran, presumably because he's been very critical of the country. But that's irrelevant. If he can't get a visa, then he can't go there. And by his own rule, he shouldn't talk about it.
Yes. So that reminds me of, in the debate, now, Smith, well, whatever, it's criticizing his debate tactics beyond, who cares? But Smith did say,
And my primary reaction to the debate is I just can't imagine spending time listening to people with nothing important to contribute. Right? Dave Smith and Douglas Murray arguing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's just such a mid-wit conversation that the only reason it's worthy of any coverage is because of the principles that are involved. The principles in terms of how do we verify what is true, what is expertise, not because there's any inherent quality to listening to Dave Smith and Douglas Murray talk about pretty much anything.
I haven't visited Nazi Germany. Does that mean I can't talk about Nazi Germany? To which Murray retorted, well, you can't time travel, but you can travel. But again, that misses the point of the argument, which is if you have this epistemological standard, it would suggest that you can't talk about events from the past, right? I mean, if you took it quite seriously.
Yeah, I mean, the standard isn't you're only qualified to talk about a country in detail or extensively once you've been there. Then any
unless you can't go there.
Yeah, that rule wouldn't make sense.
Yes, it would not make sense.
And of course, the claim also invites follow-up questions like, if I've been to Tel Aviv, can I talk about Jerusalem? If I've been to Donetsk, can I talk about Kiev?
If I went last month, can I talk about this month?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I respect Murray as a commentator, particularly on the issue of immigration in Europe, which he's written very eloquently about. But I think this is just a complete.
I mean, I don't respect him as anything more than someone who makes predictable partisan talking points. I mean, I'm glad he's fighting for my side, and I'm glad he's influential with people who do not have the fortitude or the interest in doing intellectual work.
Completely absurd argument.
Right.
Anyway, he made a number of other rather bizarre arguments, which we don't have to get into, which I lay out in the article. But my point in reviewing all of this was to show that Murray himself is not an expert by the standards of his defenders, i.e. someone who doesn't make embarrassing factual errors or employ highly questionable forms of argumentation. I think Murray is perfectly qualified to talk about both Ukraine and Israel-Gaza, even though I don't necessarily agree with him on the issues.
Right.
But I think so is Smith, even though Smith too has made embarrassing errors, during the course of his discussions of these or related topics. So I'm saying both men are entitled to discuss these topics extensively on major podcasts, whereas Murray's defenders seem to be suggesting that Murray's perfectly qualified. The people he's criticizing aren't.
Right. And so the important point, it seems to me, that you're making there is, okay, so let's say Cofnas makes this defense of Murray. He says, look, Murray's this he's a very educated man. He writes books with voluminous footnotes. He's done more research. He's a more serious guy. But you're pointing out, well, look, if you take...
Right. If your footnotes are to bogus made up sources, that's not impressive.
In the claims that he made in his book, which was, had voluminous footnotes, there are still, what would we say, egregious mistakes in there, correct?
Or at least mistakes that people who are themselves quite knowledgeable about the topic, such
claim are
egregious. Such as this leftist journalist, Nathan Robertson.
Right.
He's co-wrote a chapter with Noam Chomsky about Israel-Palestine.
Right.
There are claims that people with, a certain amount of knowledge themselves regard as egregiously wrong. Now, of course, many alleged factual errors in many debates are only factual errors from one side's point of view. I mean, some, almost everyone will agree are factual errors, but others are not of that kind.
Well, germane to your point, many people used to criticize Noam Chomsky, at least, for not having expertise in the political topics about which he was opining, right? They would say, look, appears to be
Jewish.
Yes, because Smith, just for example, I mean, I think Smith said something about how Wesley Clark said Wolfowitz told him something, or that was the first time. And Murray basically suggested that if you're bringing up Wolfowitz, you're doing so to dirty the air with some kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Yeah.
I mean, of course, there are people that could reasonably be called anti-Semitic
Yes,
talk
there
about
are.
Israel-Palestine.
Right.
I don't think Dave Smith is one of them. And also, it's the exact same form of argumentation that woke leftists use.
Correct. Exactly.
I'm going to interpret this innocuous statement very uncharitably,
Right.
and even sort of raise the possibility that you might be not necessarily being anti-Semitic, but creating a fertile ground for anti-Semitism. I mean, it's exactly the woke leftist form of argumentation.
It's also hardly like bizarre or some kind of reach to talk about people who played a prominent role in American foreign policy if we're discussing a relevant issue. So yes, I agree with you. So
anyway,
so yeah, your argument is by these standards, by these very standards, perhaps Douglas Murray would also be disqualified. But that's not what you want to see happen. Rather, you're open to more voices and more boisterous debate, I take it.
So if you have a 100 IQ, you're simply not capable of a more challenging discussion, right? Midwits are going to reach for midwit entertainment. People who are regular listeners of the Joe Rogan podcast are not people with the ability to engage in rigorous and demanding cognitive labor.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not personally very interested in what some of these kookier commentators have to say.
Right.
I don't regularly listen to Joe Rogan's podcast. I don't listen to Candace Owens' podcast. Occasionally she pops up on my Twitter feed. But that doesn't mean that I think that Joe Rogan is sort of uniquely irresponsible for platforming various people with views outside the mainstream.
Yeah, you say something along the lines of you would like.
I watch quite a lot of sports. All right, sports is a lowbrow endeavor.
A large gamut of perhaps even conspiracy theorizing and questioning of received wisdom, right?
Yeah, I mean, just before I get on to my arguments, the one area where I would agree with Murray and his defenders is that debates are invariably more informative than, not invariably, but usually more informative than interviews.
So have I considered inviting David Starkey on the show? I haven't, because there's nothing where he has expertise that I haven't heard him address, right? If I felt like I could contribute, then I'd want to bring him on if I could steer him in a new important direction. But he consistently tackles all the relevant contemporary topics where I think he's got important things to say. I just don't know what I'd contribute by bringing him on.
Expertise. So why don't you make that point and perhaps I can challenge you.
Yeah. So my first reason for being more tolerant than some people of views outside the mainstream or speculative claims in geopolitics and politics more broadly is that expertise, although it exists to a certain extent in fields like geopolitics, is not like expertise in physics. Both various of Murray's defenders sort of drew analogies between experts in fields like physical science and the experts that Murray wants to have around on topics like the ones that he debated with Smith. But I don't think that's a good analogy. I mean, physicists and other natural scientists can predict things to the 10th decimal place, as Nassim Taleb likes to say, whereas economists and geopolitics commentators can't predict better than cab drivers. So this was shown. That's a Taleb quip. This was shown most famously in a big study by Phil Tetlock, the psychologist, and some colleagues, where they surveyed a large number of experts.
So much of the value of expertise is in making accurate predictions, right? If you're unable to make accurate predictions, then you obviously don't possess that particular value, right?
Over, I think it was almost 2 decades. Yes. And asked them to make precise forecasts concerning mainly geopolitical and macroeconomic events. And
so out of the hard sciences, right, experts in the soft sciences effectively aren't any better at making predictions than cab drivers, right? They don't add value with their predictions.
Policies. And the basic finding was that these so-called experts did barely better than chance, and they did worse than simple extrapolations, like assuming what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years is what is either what happened last year or what would have happened based on the continuation of a recent trend.
Right.
So they can't do better than just a very simple extrapolation from the data we already have. Now that seems to me like an extremely profound finding, and many people have praised the study by Tetlock, and that's been written about by numerous other scholars, Pinker and others.
Right.
And it demonstrates an important point, which is that the human society, or especially
one of the admirable things about Steve Saylor and I think one of the admirable things about Charles Murray and Christopher Caldwell is that they don't expend much effort in making predictions because they recognize they don't have any particular expertise in making predictions. They are very good often at recognizing what's already happening that other people are not acknowledging.
Geopolitics and macroeconomics are just inherently...
Right. If you're better able to articulate and convey with precision what's happening right now than other narratives and descriptions of reality, then you're providing a valuable service.
Unpredictable.
Yeah.
The geopolitical system is chaotic. It's subject to the whims of human agency. We can't ever run controlled experiments where we sort of assign 5 countries to be invaded by the US and 5 not, and see how democratic they are in 10 years.
Right.
And as a consequence, there's just less scope for expertise. That's not to say that some people don't know more and have more wise opinions than others. I mean, I'm not claiming there's zero expertise. I'm just claiming it's not like physics where...
So consumers of alt media are not likely to not seek out the greatest degree of expertise that they can possibly attain if they have a pressing health problem or legal problem or accounting problem, right? If expertise will deliver value to you, you will seek it out, even if you believe we never got to the moon, even if you believe in all sorts of conspiracy theories, because when it comes to your vital interests, you did not evolve to be gullible, right? You are the evolutionary product of dozens of generations that survived and passed on their genes by being very difficult to manipulate against your vital interests.
A large majority of the questions have experimentally known right answers that no expert really questions.
Right. Okay. So you have other arguments related to Talib. Do you want to, is it better to go over those and then I'll challenge all of them, or stop on
let
this point?
me go over all the arguments and then you can tear them to shreds.
Yeah. All right.
So my second point is that not only are the differences in expertise in a domain like geopolitics much more compressed.
Right, so this is Noah Carl who's speaking here with Bo Weingard, and this is an Aporia magazine podcast.
If the smartest physicist is 100 and someone who knows nothing about physics is a 0, then in geopolitics the smartest person is, I don't know, a 10 or a 20, maybe maybe a 30.
Yeah. Right.
So not only are the differences in expertise much smaller, but it's much harder to measure them, to identify them. In physics.
So there are situations where expertise is vital, and then there are all sorts of other situations where the experts don't bring value.
You could, almost everyone with a PhD in physics will have a very good understanding of at least basic physics and the specialist field that he or she has chosen to research. Anyone who's published a paper in a top physics journal can be regarded as an expert.
On the other hand, people with PhDs in economics are not going to be better at predicting the next recession than cab drivers.
This isn't true in many domains in social science. Not all, but many, particularly geopolitics. And one reason it's hard to tell who's an expert and who isn't is that in geopolitics and related domains, moral considerations play a huge role. As I point out in the article, there are very strong correlations between people's claims about factual matters in geopolitics and their moral or normative views.
New York Times has an article here for Trump. Civil rights protections should help white men. So whatever group you belong to, you can make a very good case that your group is being victimized, because the stronger your in-group identity, the more likely you are to see your group as a victim, because a sense of victimization is a very powerful tool for people to sacrifice on behalf of their in-group. And so white men, black men, Asian women, Muslim transsexuals, like every group can make a rigorous case for why they are uniquely persecuted. And so it's not surprising that in the victimhood Olympics, finally white men are fighting back. So prior to the 1960s, people did not compete to accumulate victimhood points. But during the 1960s, it became a source of prestige and status to be a victim. And now white men are about the last group to effectively fight back in the victimhood Olympics, and they have their own case to make. So Trump officials pick and choose which civil rights protections they want to enforce and for whom. And so civil rights and freedom, right, they depend upon your particular hero system, right? So I see Donald Trump as expanding the Overton window of what you can talk about. But I can understand why people on the left feel like we have less freedom of speech now under Donald Trump. And they can make a substantial argument for why freedom of speech has diminished. But freedom has no meaning unless it is related to your particular hero system. For Trump supporters and for people on the right, life as they experience it comes with an increased freedom of speech under Donald Trump so far, a few months into his second term. And for people on the left, life as they experience it comes along with a decreased level of freedom of speech. So Donald Trump has abandoned many of the core tenets of the Civil Rights Act, which want an uneven playing field in favor of certain protected groups. Now, Donald Trump is taking civil rights measures, right, not to help the groups that are aligned with the Democratic Party, but to help groups aligned with the Republican Party, right? So whichever administration you have in office, they always have to pick and choose which civil rights protections they want to enforce and for whom. So now we have all these government agencies that have historically worked on behalf of, say, Black people and women and other sacred groups who are key supporters of the Democratic Party. And now, under Donald Trump, these government agencies have pivoted to investigating institutions accused of favoring Black people, women, and the traditional core constituencies of the Democratic Party. So for many of Trump's supporters, white Christian men are the most discriminated against people in American society. And Donald Trump has talked about a definite anti-white feeling in this country. And so the pro-diversity crowd usually makes arguments that are anti-white, but they don't frame them as anti-white. They frame them as pro-diversity. But pro-advancement of non-white men is anti-white male. So the mayor of Chicago publicly claimed that he has primarily hired Black people because Black people are the most generous people on the planet. So it would make sense that people who don't like to see that sort of racial discrimination would want to investigate it. And now Trump is investigating Harvard because Harvard, for decades, has discriminated against white people and Asians. The average student who gets into medical school who's Black or Latino has lower test scores and lower grade point averages than the average white and Asian who is rejected from medical school. So for those people who are kind of tired of anti-white, anti-male, anti-Christian discrimination, this is hilarious to see the pro-diversity crowd hoisted on their own petards. And I love that Donald Trump has issued an executive order banning the use of disparate impact, right? A legal theory at war with reality. Given that different peoples have different gifts, right, you would expect reality to have different results for different groups.
Almost no one who believes that Western meddling played a key role in causing the Ukraine war wants to give Ukraine like long-range missiles that could hit Moscow. Whereas many people that believe Western meddling played no role and that Putin's nostalgia for the Russian Empire plays a dominant role, many of those people do want to give Ukraine long-range missiles that could strike Moscow. So because moral considerations are so important and because they color our interpretation of the facts, you know, one man's partisan hack can be another man's well-informed pundit. And indeed, many of the people who agree with Murray's views on Israel-Palestine will understandably regard him as a very well-informed pundit, whereas many of the people who disagree will regard him as the exact opposite.
Yes.
It's not really possible to definitively say who's right. I mean, unless you sort of sit down for many hours or days going over every single fact with reference to, you know, a stack of books and maybe AI and a panel of experts selected from all sides of the debate. So that's my second point. And my third is that, related point is that, dazzling credentials like Ivy League degrees and books from top academic publishers and apparent expertise can go hand in hand with a very bad understanding of the world. And the example I give in the article is the so-called experts that believe that Jeffersonian democracy could be brought to Afghanistan. And whereas in the end, as the joke goes, the US spent 20 years and $2 trillion to replace the Taliban with the Taliban.
Right, this is Ann Coulter speaking with John Lott.
In economics. And now more gun myths. What is your latest book called? I'm sorry.
Gun control myths.
Yes. And there are a lot of them out there. But there was one thing in particular I wanted John to come on and talk about because, well, as he will explain, no one is covering this. And it's just this shocking attack on free speech from the Biden administration that we now know because Tulsi Gabbard declassified this shocking report. So could you talk about that, John?
Sure. Well, in June 2021, the Biden administration put out a report on domestic terrorism and what they were going to do about it. But that entire report that they made public dealt with criminal activities by so-called domestic terrorists. What Tulsi Gabbard declassified a couple of weeks ago was the rest of the report. And to me, what really made it different than what was originally put out was they were talking about going after non-criminal activity, what they call concerning non-criminal activity. And so, over the last few years, there have been a number of whistleblowers or leaks that have come out in places like the FBI about how they've taken down license plate numbers from school board meetings or kind of infiltrated different Catholic groups or done a number of other things that are there. But the administration would always come back and say, well, we're only dealing with criminals here. We're not trying to go after other types of people.
So for people on the right, they experience the Biden years as highly censorious.
Fortunately, what the report makes clear, what the part that was declassified, was that, in fact, they were very concerned about non-criminal activity. So when, one of the leaks that came out was that during the Biden administration was that they were looking for symbols that people would have. Would you go and put 2A on your social media account? Or would you go and talk about the right to keep and bear arms? Or would you have a picture of the Betsy Ross flag there, the flag with the circle of stars from the Revolutionary War as indications that the individual could be a domestic terrorist? Here, obviously they just wanted to go and identify people. I mean, just this week, we had Marco Rubio make a statement about how even in the State Department, they had a division there that was going and collecting social media posts from American citizens. I mean, why would the State Department be doing that? And there were real consequences. One of the things that the declassified document talks about is going after people for their financial accounts. So there was so-called debanking. So, we had a number of people not.
When I think about how sensitive I am to social reactions and to maintaining my own narratives and finding a place to contribute, it just occurs to me one of the easiest ways that we can make a better world is by bestowing our attention upon good people and courageous people and giving less attention to people who are not elevated and courageous, right? It's one of the most valuable things that you can do is to give attention, right? I have so often been desperate and needy in my life, and people in a situation of desperation are highly likely to make terrible choices. And if you spot someone who is worthy and they're in a desperate situation, giving them some of your attention is possibly life-changing. And if you consistently bestow your attention upon good people, members of your own tribe, your community, people that you have good reason to take care of, protect, and help, right? Let's bestow our attention on the good, the deserving, the courageous, and the needy to whom we have responsibilities. And let's bestow much less of our attention, for example, on pointless partisan hacks. I agree with Douglas Murray on everything. I enjoy his accent. I enjoy his arguments, but he doesn't advance the ball in terms of optimizing for truth. I enjoy much of the commentary on the All In podcast, but it doesn't optimize for truth, right? Ben Shapiro, he articulates, what I believe, but this is not a person who's optimizing for truth. So we can choose to bestow our attention on those who are courageous and optimize for truth rather than those who just make safe talking points.
Not engaged in any criminal activity. For example, lawyers that work for Trump. I mean, you're a lawyer, obviously. People who are just giving legal advice. I mean, you can agree or disagree. I mean, obviously, any legal case that you have, you're going to have people on either side agreeing.
So I wince when I see Donald Trump's bullying tactics, but then I recognize that almost all of our institutions are controlled by the left. And when the left has power, they are not averse to bullying. And so maybe some of this Donald Trump bullying will do more good than harm. Maybe given that currently people on the right cannot overtake institutions on the slow march, maybe Aaron Rand is right. The only way for the right to take over institutions is from the top down.
Or disagreeing on who's right in terms of the law that's there. But, so you had people like John Eastman, who had his Bank of America account was canceled. No warning, just immediately canceled there, and he had no recourse. He had an account at USAA.
Can you explain, how does that happen? I mean, I know it happened to V there too, the immigration website. They were thrown off PayPal and they're debanked in every possible way. And it just occurred to me listening to you talk about it. I mean, what happens? You get a notice from the bank? Do you have to go with a suitcase and pick up your money? How do you get your money? What does that mean to be debanked?
Well, that's exactly what happened. I mean, look, this is something that started in a sense under the Obama administration with his
life is safer and happier and more harmonious for most people in the center of the herd. And that means you don't challenge the herd, right? You don't say things that put you at odds with the herd. And if you choose to do that, you should accept that life is going to become more painful and more dangerous and more difficult for you. And not everyone has the fortitude to do that.
Called Operation Choke Point, where the federal government would put pressure on financial institutions that dealt with companies that the Obama administration didn't like. Like if you were in the oil industry or you were in the firearms industry, they would go and essentially close down.
So which industry is the most right-wing? It is arms manufacturing. Like virtually everyone in the arms manufacturing industry is right-wing. People in the oil industry tend to be right-wing.
Your accounts. Now, could companies still function without a banking relationship, without somebody to handle their checks or handle their credit cards for their customers, or even having a bank account to deposit things in? Yeah, you can function, but it's a lot more costly. For civilians, basically, you're forced to be on a cash basis. And there are a lot of things that you can't do on a purely cash basis these days. Try buying something on the internet on a basic, cash basis.
Weren't there any banks who could resist that?
So Jesus had his time in the Garden of Gethsemane before he was crucified on a cross. And he, according to the gospel narrative, recognized that he was about to face a lot of pain. And Jesus, in the Christian gospel narrative, pled with God, please take this cup from me. Please don't allow me to suffer. But in the final analysis, not my will, but thy will be done. So even in the Christian narrative, Jesus doesn't want to suffer to the extent that he is going to suffer. And for every 100 or every 1,000 people who want to be heroic, only one usually has the fortitude to go through with it.
I know John Eastman tried multiple banks. Once you unfortunately, it's not just John. You had other lawyers. You had people who were supposedly debanked because of their religious or political views. The Biden administration was looking at whether people believed in the Latin Mass for Catholics or whatever. I mean, why? I mean, that's going pretty far afield in terms of, those would be the top people on my list for terrorist activity, the people that are very religious there. But
So I because I subscribe to Apple News Plus and I read The Atlantic and The New Yorker and New York Magazine, right? These left of center elite media publications are consistently making the case that Donald Trump is the worst president ever for freedom of speech. Right? Complete opposite of my experience. But the type of bullying that John Lott here is describing taking place under the Obama and Biden administrations, right, for people on the left, they see that Trump is much worse.
So, you know, are there ways you can exist? Yeah. I mean, people still live, but it makes their lives a lot more difficult.
How would an oil company deal with this?
You probably have to go and talk to an oil company, but
Okay.
I know, you know, all I know is that there are.
So the Obama and Biden administrations made it very, very difficult for oil companies to get capital to invest in developing fossil fuels.
Workarounds that exist, but it raises their costs. And one of the reasons why they did this was to force some of them to go out of business, and some did. But so Trump, when he won during his first term, he immediately got.
So when Nathan Cofnas decried the amount of bullying that Donald Trump does and described it as MAGA communism, right, that didn't ring true to me because in my familiarity with politics in advanced societies, every administration does a considerable amount of bullying of the private sector. So I'm not convinced that Trump is doing a disproportionate amount. What's unusual with Donald Trump is that he's so open about the bullying, while the Biden and Obama administration were better able to hide their bullying with the assistance of the elite and the mainstream media. Oh, come on, man. I just bloody hell lost my place.
No, that's exactly what happened. I mean, look, this is rounds that exist, but it raises their costs. And one of the reasons why they did this was to force some of them to go out of business, and some did. But so Trump, when he won during his first term, he immediately got rid of the Operation Choke Point. Biden reinstituted it, and apparently, according to these documents, made it much broader than just going after companies. We're also including.
So the Obama administration tried to do away with due process for the prosecution of charges of bad sexual behavior by largely men on college campuses. And then when Trump entered office, both in his first and his second term, he sought to restore due process. So presidential administrations on the left would bully universities to follow their left-wing agenda. So I'm not yet distraught that Trump is bullying universities to follow a non-left agenda. Oh, man, this is tricky trying to...
But so Trump, when he won during his first term, he immediately got rid of the Operation Choke Point. Biden reinstituted it, and apparently, according to these documents, made it much broader than just going after companies. We're also including individuals in this.
In response to this, have we found any like random individuals who had, I don't know, the Gadsden flag on their social media who had action taken against them? You'd think maybe they'd step forward now, or maybe they're all banned from social media.
Well, I mean, when the leaks came out during the Biden administration, when they were talking about looking for the symbolism as a proxy for whether somebody was a domestic terrorist, you know, the agents themselves said that there had been people that had been identified, at least initially. It wasn't the final dispositive thing for whether or not they would be classified as terrorists or not. But, you know, I don't know if I ever had a list. I was talking to John Eastman recently, and he was saying that based on these new declassified documents, he was going to file some Freedom of Information Act requests to go and find out exactly what the trail was with regard to him.
It's really shocking. I saw your tweet on it, your article in, I guess, Real Politics. But you say that even the conservative media, obviously the mainstream media has not breathed a word of this, but even the conservative media isn't really picking up on this. And it is one of the most shocking things about that the Biden administration did. I mean, the border and this.
Right. Well, no, I mean, I agree with you. Look, I mean, you had places like the Washington Examiner and the Daily Caller had stories on it, and maybe it's just they get overloaded with so many different things. But to me, as I say, the most important thing is the fact that they expanded it to not just criminal activity, but for non-criminal activity. I mean, that's, you know, the document that was declassified will talk about things like supporting freedom of expression. But they also have they say that twice, but many more times they talk about combating disinformation. kind of reminded me when J.D. Vance was giving his talk a little while ago in Germany, and you had all these politicians in Europe going and saying you have to have censorship in order to protect free speech and in order to protect democracy. It's
right. So protecting democracy means limiting majority rule. That's also another part of elite consensus. In his latest essay for Real Clear Politics, John Lott talks about how the crime rates of illegal migrants are vastly underreported. Why? Because they are primarily interacting with other illegal immigrants, and illegal immigrants are much less likely to have these crimes reported out of fear of deportation. So as the population of illegal immigrants grows, right, underreporting also grows. So we've got this elite narrative and news media relentless narrative. Illegal immigrants, they don't commit crimes compared to Native Americans, ordinary American citizens, but it's vastly distorted by the astronomical African-American crime rate among American citizens, and also by the underreporting of crime by illegals.
kind of almost word for word, it seemed like what we were hearing from those European leaders that were there. And, they were talking about this document talked about the U.S. taking the lead in terms of combating disinformation around the world. They were talking about working in the framework of this Christchurch Accord after the mosque shooting that had occurred there. And, you go and read through this stuff. They talk about going after hate speech, which included things at the time like going and identifying that mass murderer as a socialist. I don't know, maybe that's considered hate speech or not. I mean, obviously, all the documents there were trying to paint him as some right winger, but maybe you have a broader group of right-wing friends than I do, but I don't know any right-wing friends of mine who kind of consider China's communist government as being the ideal form of government to go and have, or to go and have rules that limit how many kids that people can have because having kids is destroying the environment. Or, maybe, I don't know, I have a very isolated group of people that I talk to.
Now, didn't you say that anyone who posted on social media what you just said, identifying the shooter as a socialist and, save the earth, depopulate the earth, that was also a sign of domestic terrorism?
Well, it was a sign of hate speech, and it was something that they were,
Right. So what constitutes hate speech and what constitutes a likely domestic terrorist depends upon the nature of your hero system.
Put pressure on social media companies in order. I had my accounts frozen when I put that out. I wrote about that in the New York Daily News. The irony is I wrote about it in the New York Daily News, and then I tweeted it out in another account that I had from the Crime Prevention Research Center. And then they froze that one because I was citing the New York Daily News article that was there. But
wow.
The New York Daily News is hardly, it's hardly a right-wing publication that's there. So, but anyway.
Throughout 2016, the Daily News was even more obnoxious about Donald Trump than the HuffPo was. There were just endless front pages with Trump dressed up as a clown. So yeah, this isn't this wasn't in Human Events. Why do you think this isn't getting more attention from the conservative media?
I don't know. I talked to reporters at Fox. I tried to get them to go and do something. I know the reporters seem interested, but I don't know whether the editors just weren't interested in doing the story. I don't think they've covered it at all, let alone the part that I think is particularly important there. I don't know whether it's just that there's so much overload.
Unfortunately, John Lott significantly diminished his credibility by his really shoddy research alleging massive amounts of voter fraud in the 2020 election.
In terms of news stories occurring, I think this is extremely important. If you're going to stop these types of things from happening in the future, people have to know that this was something that was actually happening. And it seems to just have gone down a memory hole. But nobody needs to. I assume you've read the original document now that she declassified, and people can go to our website at crimeresearch.org, and we have the op-ed that I put up with links to the document so people can go and check it out themselves. Nobody needs to take my word for this, but you probably have a better.
I just realized I assume only the conservative media would be interested in a shocking attack on free speech. But there are some liberals. They tend to be the older ones.
Well, they're also switching party allegiances, some of those old-time liberals. USAID to Department of Justice, the FBI, the State Department, all of them are listed in this document as working on this. I mean, it's really an amazing collection.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the whole federal government was involved. But, you have a situation here where, again, if people don't know about it, it's not gonna keep it from happening again. I worry that it's something that could start again.
Yes, they are really enthusiastic censors. Is there anything else I wanted to ask you about that before we get to guns?
Most fiscally responsible president ever, something like that yesterday. They're going to fold, and I think this thing gets through in the next 48 hours.
I think Dan's right.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I went to an event, the American Conservative Union, the organization that puts on CPAC. They were handing out their ratings they do for congressmen. So I was at that event, and a lot of the guys were and ladies were passing in, and I was trying to grab as many as I could to find out where things stand. All of them said the same thing, Mark. It's happening. It's happening. It's just a question of how much pain you get before it happens. But one thing that kept, two things were consistent. Number one, they all raved on Trump's performance. They said he didn't even use his script. He just went off, and it was classic Trump behind closed doors, number one, and they all loved it. And number two, which I found very interesting, they said, listen, this isn't the last vote. So even those who were holding out recognize that they got to go through this again. And so they're going to toe the line, and they're going to move this forward.
Yeah. And I have to say, though, like the one thing that is remarkable is just how bad the Democratic messaging has been on this. They are all over the place. We've spent the week talking about Joe Biden, most of last week talking about Joe Biden. The fact that like it does appear, and facts are hard to get from this bill, that it's going to throw 8 million people off Medicaid. Now, according to Republican estimates, Democrats have said 15. Like that alone should be a fight Democrats want to have all day, every day. 8 million versus 15 million, because Trump said don't effing touch it, which of course they're going to. So it does make me kind of sigh how bad the Democrats have been seizing an opportunity.
You might not want that fight if the American people learn that those 8 million or even 15 million are people that shouldn't be getting Medicaid at all if they're not in this country legally, if we've been subsidizing Gavin Newsom's gift to illegal immigrants, if it's fraud, if there are people who are able-bodied and getting benefits that they were never designed to get. Be careful what you wish for if you want that fight.
That sounds like Doge, and Doge went underwater real fast when reality hit.
So let me just say a couple things, and then we'll move on, and obviously we'll continue to talk about reconciliation. First, I'm so glad we took the president live yesterday on his arrival with the Hill, because that incredible line that we all laughed at where he said, Mike Johnson, a man of God. I was like, well, I'm a man of God too, but he's really a man of God. I didn't see that picked up anywhere. And if we hadn't shared it live together, we wouldn't have seen it. At least I wouldn't have. Second is, I think one of the most undercovered stories about Donald Trump is the ways in which he's a better president this time than he was last time. And one thing which was in sharp relief yesterday, and you saw it when he was talking to Speaker Johnson, about standing with Speaker Johnson and talking about Thune and Johnson. You saw it based on the reports of how he did in the conference that Larry referenced. He understands the personalities and the rhythms and the dynamics of Capitol Hill much better than he did the first term, much better. And I hear that in talking to people about his interactions with the staff that deals with the Hill, and with the president dealing with members. And that includes the vice president, who wasn't a senator for very long, but also because he's a brilliant guy, understands the rhythms, not just of the House, of the Senate where he served, but also of the House. And a lot of the people around the president on the legislative affairs team do as well. And it's a massive advantage. And his first term would have been different. And again, I'm only talking about tactics and strategy and performance here. I'm not talking about his policies. But the first term would have been different if he had had this level of experience. And of course, it's always the challenge when you have an outsider get elected president. Bill Clinton had the same learning curve problems. Barack Obama had some of them, even though he'd been in the Senate. Bush didn't, for a variety of reasons, in part because his dad had been president. But it's a real striking difference. And Capitol Hill Press Corps always, I've said this before, they always cover these things like perils of Pauline. It'll never pass. But when it passes, which we all think it will, it's going to be a pretty extraordinary legislative achievement. There's still people on the Hill who are saying to me now they should have done 2 bills. And remember, there was the talk 1 bill or 2 bills. There are still people saying 2 bills. I just have never understood the 2 bill argument. There's some upsides to it, but the downsides are immense. And mostly it's asking the Congress to do the impossible twice is more than twice as hard as asking him to do it once. And if this passes, again, I'll say it'll be to a large extent testament to Donald Trump's greater knowledge of how Capitol Hill works. And you can just see it. Just go back and look at the way he talked about Speaker Johnson and John Thune yesterday. It's extremely nuanced, the things he said, and it's a reflection of his understanding of them as people, the challenges they face, and how they have pulled together. Lastly, the Thune-Johnson relationship is remarkably undercovered, and that's a big part of what, if this bill passes, a big part of the success as well. All right, enough for.
So Donald Trump has just been remarkably pro-Israel, right? He's done so much for the Jewish state of Israel, and yet there's a remarkable lack of gratitude displayed here by many people in the pro-Israel camp, such as by Gadi Taub.
To take control of the humanitarian aid and distribute it only in areas that the IDF would occupy, thus depriving Hamas from one of its most important tools for controlling the population.
So during this discussion, Gadi is repeatedly blasting Trump and saying that Netanyahu has to find the balls and the courage to explicitly go against Donald Trump's wishes. And you've never had a more pro-Israel president than Donald Trump. Right? This is just gross ingratitude and living in denial of reality.
As well as a source of supply which sustained itself.
And a source of money, because it also sells the aid.
Yeah, they tax, other people distribute the aid, and they taxed it like with I think 30% or something on that scale. So the aid basically sustained Hamas. The Biden administration forced Israel to give it in a way that the IDF could not control. Herzi Halevi did nothing to try and gain control over the supplies, but now the plan is completely different, and the reserve soldiers have been called for the.
So counterinsurgency strategy, whether in Vietnam, where it was developed by the US, and then in Iraq, where it received its most famous application, and now you see it with Israel in Gaza. Counterinsurgency strategy means seizing control of land and then protecting it from insurgents and terrorists, and incentivizing people to move there for a higher quality of life and protecting them.
Sixth time, and told that they are going into Gaza to occupy it. Of course, at this moment precisely, Hamas has returned to the negotiating table. So the operation is now moving in full force. Here is the problem. The problem, except Hamas, and again, they will try to drag us into endless negotiations, which will save them from destruction or postpone the Israeli attack. But then there's another problem. And the problem is Brigadier General Yifat Tomer Yerushalmi, who is the Army Attorney General. And as you know, Israel is controlled by jurists.
Right, you don't want judges running your defense strategy. You don't want judges having the final say on everything that your government does. All right, rule of law is not co-equal with rule of judges.
Not by its elected government, or neither is the army controlled by the chief of staff. The real commanding officer in the army is Yifat Tomer Yerushalmi, who said it is illegal for Israel to withhold aids from areas.
All right, if something is vital to your national security interests, you should not be constrained by whether or not it is legal.
Yeah, I would like it if the Trump administration would say that the defeat, clearly, that the defeat of Hamas is the goal, is the goal of American policy. I don't believe that they have said that, if I'm not mistaken. And exactly what the goal of American policy is a little bit unclear, and it shifts from day to day. If I had to predict, however, I bet you we're going to see a ceasefire sooner rather than later, because as I understand it, there's a Witkoff proposal that they're working on in general, And if I have the correct information, there's a kind of revised Witkoff proposal out there now that there will be for the release of 10 hostages, there will be a 20 or 30-day ceasefire. I bet you as Israeli military operations begin to pinch against Hamas, I bet Hamas would take that.
Yeah, that would be that may be a disaster, because the reserve soldiers are showing signs of nervousness, and saying that they can't be called and then have the operation called off indefinitely. They have been, some of these people have been in reserve service, have left their families, their work, their business for almost the whole duration of the war. It's more than a year and a half now, and it can't be postponed forever. You know my opinion that the way to get the hostages is just to pressure Hamas continuously until it screams for help and gives them up. I don't believe there any deals they sign, and I think that what they're going to try to do, and they're sophisticated about it, is try to trap the Israeli government between the pressure of the anti-Netanyahu movement and the outside pressures of an American president who wants to finish the war. So that in the end we will find ourselves at the end of this war without a victory, and that is a very, very serious thing. I think Israel cannot allow itself. I think the Netanyahu government cannot allow itself. And if we lose the war and get the hostages in return, then that would mean that you can bring Israel to its knees by kidnapping citizens. That is a terrible message to our enemies.
We should say a couple words. You referred to it obliquely, the release of Eidan Alexander, and about the Americans negotiating with Hamas over the heads of the Israelis. That what you're referring to is the fact that this American-Israeli hostage was released, and that apparently the Israeli government had no idea that this negotiation with the Americans was going on. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, and the repercussions here were serious, because immediately the press here, which is, as you know, a leftist choir, jumped on this and started declaring that if you don't have an American passport, then nobody will save you. That is a way to badmouth the Netanyahu government, which is a despicable thing to say, because around 150 hostages were released by Israel, whether in a deal or by military pressure. But you see the anti-Netanyahu bring them home now movement and Hamas operating in tandem. You know, Hamas releases footage of hostages crying for help on Saturday evenings when the Kaplan demonstrations are on. And they repeat the same message. Hamas dictates to its hostages to say on camera that it is Netanyahu's fault, that if Netanyahu would only want, they would be home, and so forth. And then the Kaplan people are repeating it. Because in a sense, their goals are the same. The goal is to undermine the right-wing government.
The goal, and the goal is also to get a ceasefire, and to get a ceasefire that will undermine
and finish the war without an Israeli victory, because that would topple
finish
Netanyahu.
the war with a draw, which would be an Israeli defeat, which can be laid at the hands of the Netanyahu government. Of course, the hostage families, and there are many people who just want to see the hostages released. They're not thinking about this strategically, just about the outcome of the effect on the lives of the hostages. Okay, should we move on to Trump and the Middle East?
Sure. So what is going on, Mike? Has Trump turned his back on Israel?
Well, let's lay out quickly why there is a widespread concern in Israel, or a sense of having been downgraded. And let's list there are reasons for this. One is the the Trump-Iran negotiations. That was not those were not that was not Prime Minister Netanyahu. I see that I somehow held my thumb up. Oh, it's gone now, and the Zoom's
showed
thumbs
you
up
asking for a
question or something.
asking for permission to speak, which you don't need on this program.
Most usually, I don't need it. He ignored, or overrode Prime Minister Netanyahu's advice about how to proceed with Iran, and that was upsetting, I think, to a lot of people. Then there was we just discussed. I only read it in English. I haven't read his name in Hebrew. Is it Eden Alexander or Edan? How do you say his name?
Edan Alexander.
Edan Alexander. And then the release of the hostage. So this hostage negotiation with Hamas is going on without the Israelis knowing it. There was the decision on the Houthis. And just before President Trump went to the Gulf, he announced a ceasefire with the Houthis, but the Houthis responded by launching ballistic missiles successfully at Israel. So that clearly the Israeli-Houthi conflict was not part of the American negotiated ceasefire. Then, of course, we have the trip. The trip did not include Israel on the destination as one of Trump's destinations, giving rise to the feeling that that Israel had been sidelined or downgraded in importance. And finally, there's also just the Gaza the Gaza negotiations. There's reason to believe that the Israeli government and Witkoff are not on the same page on the negotiations about a ceasefire. So all of those things together. Have I missed anything? I feel like maybe I missed something in there. Oh, also Syria. President
The visit to Giuliani.
Yeah, President Trump met with Ahmed Ashara, the leader of the interim government in Damascus, and he announced that he'll be lifting all sanctions. And that policy appeared not to have been done in consultation with Israel. So it's a combination of decisions made, but also the way they were made without any sense that Israel's input was being sought, or the effect of America's policy, say on the Houthis on Israel, was not being considered or even discussed with Jerusalem. So lack of coordination, lack of consideration, and it looks then like I think it's fair to say, increasingly, President Trump is viewing the region through the eyes of Riyadh and Ankara.
So this is how the world works. We don't tend to operate with regard to what people have done for us in the past. We tend to operate with regard to what we expect people to do for us in the future. So Donald Trump has been the most pro-Israel president ever, but now people in Israel are feeling betrayed because Donald Trump is consistently carrying out actions that indicate he's putting American interests first, not Israel's interests first. And if America is America first, it is by definition not Israel first. And you may invest a great deal in your spouse, but if your spouse sees that you're unlikely to bestow anything important going forward, right, your spouse is highly likely to leave you. You may contribute a great deal to your employer, but if your employers sees that the situation has changed and you're not likely to be valuable to him going forward, he's going to let you go. People will let you go if they don't see that you are going to contribute a great deal of value going forward, right? And it doesn't matter how much you've done for people in the past, right? People live in the present moment looking forward, and they make decisions on what they expect to get going forward, no matter how much you've done for them in the past. This is terrific. All right, this is Orion Taraban, psychologist from the YouTube channel PsychHacks.
The most toxic relationship belief is, my relationship is where I am free to be myself. I told you, you probably weren't going to believe me.
Right, that's a terrible life strategy for your relationship with other people. Right, you always have to perform and you always have to play a role if you want to maintain your status in a community, in a job, or in a partnership, or in a friendship.
However, this belief destroys relationships. Now, you might be thinking, Dr. Orion, are you saying that we should be lying and faking in our relationships? No, it does not. That's a straw man argument. What I'm saying is that you are not free to be fully and completely yourself in a relationship. This belief is toxic because the people who endorse it tend to live their lives like this. Their implicit framework is out there in the world, that's where I have to act. When I'm at my job, I have to put on a smile and do what my boss tells me. When I'm on the bus, I have to tolerate the rudeness and the body odor. When I'm with my family, I have to be a good...
Right, if you want to maintain relationships, you have to follow etiquette. If you want to maintain your position at work, you have to follow etiquette. If you deny commonly accepted applications of etiquette, you will crash into the rocks.
Daughter or the firstborn son. And sometimes even with my friends, I have to pretend to be interested in Marlene's latest interpersonal drama or Steven's ill-remembered recapitulation of whatever the media has encouraged him to think. But in my relationships, that's where I get to let it all go. That's where I just get to be myself. I don't have to try. I don't have to perform. I don't have to generate value. My relationship is where I get to drop all role-playing, be accepted unconditionally, and finally be myself. That is a toxic belief. Now, before I go any further, if you're liking what you're hearing, please consider sending this video to someone who might benefit from its message. However, a better way of thinking about it is that most people are channeling a version of themselves at work that is conducive to professionalism.
Right, and you want to channel a version of yourself in your friendships, in your communal relationships, in your synagogue and church appearances, and in your romantic relationship.
Is what we tend to socially expect from people occupying a professional role. And why do we expect this? Because it eases the professional relationship. It is easier.
Right, it's very difficult to work together with 50 other people unless people are following etiquette. Whether it's in church, in synagogue, at a stamp club, at a gym, in a workplace.
To do business with someone who is acting professionally than it is to do business with someone acting unprofessionally. Wouldn't you agree? So professionalism is a version of yourself that is appropriate to a specific kind of role because it facilitates the transaction of value. Does that make sense? The same thing is true for your intimate relationships. Boyfriend is a role. Wife is a role. This means that we tend to have certain expectations of people occupying such roles. And why do we expect this? Because it eases the intimate relationship.
People don't react well when you violate their obvious and common and expected expectations of you.
Facilitating the transaction of value, which is why the people are there. And assuming that you have a good boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife, it is a privilege to occupy that role. I hate to break it to you.
And Bob says, I don't fart in front of my girlfriend. Am I denying my girlfriend the true me? Unfortunately, I have done that with certain girlfriends. And then I'd say, aren't you glad that I feel free to be myself around you? Then there are other girlfriends that I've had who I had much more respect for and valued much more, with whom I did not do that.
To you. But the only time when you are free to be yourself is when you are alone.
Right, that's some bracing common sense that for many people, they don't think, oh, that doesn't need to be articulated. But other people do need to hear that.
Most men over 50 have a PSA test every year. Prostate cancer is a slow-growing cancer. None of this makes sense, and the timing of it being 48, 72, 96 hours before tomorrow's release of Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson's book makes this, I think, inarguably.
So this is the Commentary Magazine podcast on Monday morning, talking about Joe Biden releasing the news of his prostate cancer.
A sign of the unbelievable bungling of the Biden people that they think that they can kill this story off. The Thompson Tapper Biden's infirmities story by
the Thompson Tapper book is excellent. I'm enjoying it. I subscribe to Amazon Music, and as part of that subscription, I get one free Audible book to listen to each month. And I chose the new Jake Tapper book on Biden's cognitive decline.
Essentially appealing to the sympathies of people when this only highlights the feeling that a massive cover-up was going on that now extends to the possibility that we were not being told that the president had cancer.
Can I interrupt you there? First, we have seen this technique used by Team Biden before. If you recall, throughout Biden's presidency, whenever there were headlines about Hunter Biden, Biden Inc., the Biden family business, trading off Joe Biden's position in American politics for lucrative contracts among his family members, suddenly there would be major action on the lawfare front against Donald Trump. So you would have a bad news cycle about Hunter Biden and the Biden family, and then the very next day, a new indictment would drop. A new special counsel will be announced, all on Donald Trump. So that's one thing. If this had just come out of the blue after years of us taking the Biden family at their word, well, then it would be, as it already is, sad, right? And shock. But it's not shocking that the news came out in the way that it did. Let me put it that way. Number two, I just have here Kevin O'Connor's a letter from July 8th, 2024, talking about the visit. If you recall, on July 8th, 2024, not long after, the New York Times reported that a neurologist had visited the White House. So this is in the aftermath of the debate, the disastrous debate.
Which was June 27th.
June 27th, right?
Just to follow the timeline here.
Yeah, so just to follow the time, to get back in that mindset when we were, podcasting every day about the incredible emergency. Of course, this is also a week before. This letter's coming out a week before, or 5 days before Donald Trump is almost killed in public. So just to take you back to that amazing, incredible, crazy month. So here's what Kevin O'Connor says. It's the results of this year's exam are detailed in my February 28th letter. How we had there are no findings which would be consistent with any cerebellar or central neurological disorder. It's all about Biden's physical condition as of July 2024, and it's totally focused, if you remember, on his osteoporosis, his feet, and the condition that was making him have that shuffle. Nothing about prostate cancer. Nothing. And I think you're right, John, that it kind of beggars belief that this stage of prostate cancer would suddenly be discovered in the past, 9 months? 10 months?
10 months, I think, yeah.
Right.
No, 9 months, yeah.
So there's this, which is only reinforcing the story, as you say, that we went into the weekend covering, which is the cover up about his cognitive abilities. The Biden family, just to sum up here before we talk about other aspects of the story, the Biden family has this, I have to say, just kind of this terrible knack for politics. Every time they think that they're being clever and shifting the ground of a conversation, they only dig themselves in deeper. And so, yeah, people are like, oh, this is terrible news, but it's going to be natural for everyone to say, hold it, why didn't we know about this earlier? And by the way, what is the deal?
No, I consistently find Matthew Continenti fairly fair-minded, even though he belongs to the conventional wing of the conservative movement. He's about as fair as you can get among conventional commentators with regard to the dissident right, and I find him the most valuable contributor to this podcast.
With the recording from Robert Hur that was released on Friday night, right?
Well, that's what happened, right?
Exactly.
Is that the Robert Hur recording came out. I was on Mark Halperin's two-way Friday night, and Axios released the recording, and we listened to it for 4 minutes.
It's incredible.
And almost immediately, because since I listened to it live and was talking about it live, you are like the character assassination of Robert Hur by people who knew perfectly well that what Hur was telling was the truth. It's one thing to say they covered up Biden for, that's terrible with the American people and all of that. But, just elementary common decency, Hur obviously did the gentlest thing he could. He said, I could be indicting Biden for mishandling classified information. After all, an indictment had been handed down for Donald Trump mishandling classified information and exactly in circumstances very similar. And I didn't do it because I couldn't secure a conviction, because any jury would look and say this is essentially a senile old man.
But this is where I think there is not necessarily a strategy, but Matt's right to point to the weird timing of a lot of the way that Biden reacts to bad political news. And it's like the politics of personal lament. He trots out the fact that his son had this horrible death from cancer. And obviously all of us are deeply, deeply sad to hear that a former president now has this aggressive form of cancer. It's terrible.
People really don't like to be manipulated, right? And the more you try to manipulate people, the more they're going to resent you. On the other hand, if you're called out for doing something bad, cop to it, admit to it, apologize for it, demonstrate that you've learned from it, and it makes navigating life much easier.
Terrible. And many of us have lost loved ones to cancer. It's a horrible disease. We have nothing but sympathy. The issue, though, that is the distraction attempt is going to be a personal story from the Bidens, and then they use it to do personal destruction of anyone who challenges them. And so we've already seen representatives from the Democratic Party, people like Axelrod, saying publicly, now we can't talk about the Her tape. Now we shouldn't be discussing whether or not he was corpus mentis throughout.
So one key measure of your maturity is how much turbulence can you handle without lashing out at yourself or other people. So very typical human reaction when you're caught out for doing something wrong is to lash out at other people. Another very typical human reaction is to beat yourself down. But if you can handle stress and strain, if you can admit when you were wrong, if you can apologize, clean up the wreckage of the past, and demonstrate a commitment to forging a new path forward, you will be much more effective in life. And you will be just demonstrating adult levels of maturity
throughout his term as president, because there's this terrible news. And so I think that's what shifted. That used to work for the Bidens in politics. He trotted that out many, many times early in his presidency and as vice president to get out of sticky situations or to just appeal to people's human sympathy. And we all have that sympathy. But what he doesn't seem to understand is that we can hold in our minds two things: sympathy for his individual condition right now and deep suspicion about whether or not this family and this president was honest with the American.
And the chat says, well, if you manipulate people correctly, they won't know it, but they will sense it, right? People sense when you're being fair dinkum with them, and they sense when they're being manipulated. And people much prefer it when you are not manipulating and when you're simply being fair dinkum, which is why it's an excellent rule of thumb. Good people make you feel good, and you want to maximize your time around good people. And people who make you feel bad, you want to minimize your time around those people. So good people make you feel good, and you should want to get closer to them. Bad people make you feel bad, and you should want to protect and distance yourself. So be fair dinkum, mate.
American people.
Yeah, I have outrage. I don't have suspicion. I think the more we learn, the magnitude of this scandal is overpowering. I mean, to listen to that tape of Biden, he was out of it. He was totally out of it. He was the president of the United States of America.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And we were talking about this on the podcast at the time, and no one else was. No one else was. Maybe Alex Thompson. Yeah. Every so often, Alex Thompson would kind of have a little thing, and he was ignored. And then when the two reporters from the Wall Street Journal did it at the beginning of mid-June.
No, Orion Taraband wasn't saying you should manipulate everyone in your life. It said that you should bring a version of yourself to different situations, but recognize that there is an etiquette and that there is a role for you, whether you're a husband or wife, a son or a daughter, an employee, a supervisor, if you're a member of a church or synagogue, that different roles will require you to behave in different ways, and you should bring a version of yourself and perform to your role. That doesn't mean that you then manipulate people. It means that you live up to the expectations of your particular role and the etiquette that is expected from that role.
With all their sources, they were attacked by major media figures. They were attacked. If Karine Jean-Pierre, it's any job, public relations, that is a shame on that whatever company hires her. She should not be active in public life. The people who gaslit and attack people and try to ruin people's careers to cover up for a man who is clearly incapable of being the commander-in-chief for 4 years, that is a massive, massive outrage.
Well, that's why I brought up, I think that's why I said that the treatment of her speaks to this deeper fact, which is, look, if we talk tachlis here, as we say, Biden resigns the presidency or is 25th Amendmented out of the presidency, Kamala Harris becomes president, meaning there would be total ideological and partisan continuity It's not as though he resigns and then they have to call elections and Donald Trump mysteriously then is reelected president. That's not how we work in our system. So it goes to the question of whether, so if your panic is, oh no, Donald Trump is going to come back, right? Which is in fact what happened. That panic is not alleviated or not alleviated by the fact that the president can no longer serve as president.
John,
yeah.
It's
So
not
my point
political.
is,
It's
right.
pathological with these people. It's
No,
you
right.
look at Jill Biden, Dr. Jill Biden
Okay,
on
but
The
that-
View
yeah.
1 week ago,
Yeah.
interrupting her husband, knowing it is Lady Macbeth. I'm sorry.
But this is the reason that right. So my point here is the people who covered this up out of deep personal ambition.
Right.
Like the line that they had to protect America from Donald Trump is a lie. This is about, and I'm sorry, I'm going to name names here. This is about Jake Sullivan, his closest foreign policy advisor, and Zients and Klain and Jill
Anita
Biden
Dunn.
and all of that. And Anita Dunn, they knew, we knew. So I know they knew. We knew. That's why you say we were talking about it in 2022, 20 on the podcast, you know, before the November, whatever.
He
And
had
they-
lots of slips very early on in
Yeah.
his term. We were talking
Yeah.
about it from the very beginning.
Right. So they knew, and I'm sorry, there's a horn honking outside my window.
New
so
York
I'm a little
life.
distracted. Yeah. No,
City.
someone's annoyed, obviously, because someone's dull. He resigns the presidency due to sickness or due to infirmity. And then people say, my God, look what he did. Because
his
he
chance.
understood. What?
He had his chance in 2022.
I know.
Right?
That's what I'm saying. He could have said, we got through the midterms. I passed all this legislation. I'm now passing the torch to Kamala Harris. I'm really not well. And then he would have been a kind of celebrated, lionized figure, somebody who didn't do what the Wilsons did, didn't do what JFK and his doctors did.
But it's
Didn't
but
hide.
I just want to interrupt to say it's not just the Bidens and the Biden family and the immediate close, Politburo guard, Praetorian Guard, whatever you want to call it in the White House. This implicates Kamala Harris and every member of the cabinet as well. So in that sense, it's a broader scandal for the Democratic Party because her constitutional responsibility, after seeing that he couldn't even hold a cabinet meeting or deal with cabinet members, was to call the cabinet together and say, we have a problem, and to push that. That was her role. But her own desire for power meant that she didn't do it. And she lied repeatedly to the public. And for those of us who were not huge fans of Donald Trump coming back, if you have a choice between Harris and Trump, a lot of people went for Trump in part because she seemed to be continuing this myth about Biden's health and his abilities. And that's the implication for the Democratic Party that the Thompson and Tapper book is part of. They are also trying to make this about 2 years at the end of his term, and nobody knew, and they were fooling us and fooling the public, and isn't this terrible? That's not true. That's not what happened.
John, you're right about the personal ambition point, because if you are on Biden's team and you hear the Her tape and you care about him and not your personal ambition, you think, oh my God, we got to protect this guy from anything in the future. This is not someone we need to be trotting out on stage. This is not someone that needs to be waking up at a certain hour, that needs to be traveling, that needs to be handling questions before lights and cameras. This is a guy that needs to go off into the sunset. That would have been the kind thing to do.
Well, okay, so this is really the key point, which is, if we're right, and the prostate cancer news is older than we know, he could have been treated. In other words, they created this storyline about him. It is unlikely, as I say, that he just suddenly discovered that he had prostate.
Possible he was treated in Delaware when he spent a lot of time in his presidency at
It
a
is
place where there was
possible-
no log
it is-
kept of who visited
It
him.
is possible that he was treated for prostate cancer 10 years ago. This is HIPAA, man. This is a right. So
hasn't he had skin cancer before?
He has had skin cancer, yeah. But it was like basal cell. It was the slow growing, not melanoma.
So my point is, the mindset that they were all in about protecting him may be a much darker, way more gothic element to this. If you see what I'm saying, that because they had created this storyline from 2019 onward that he was more than capable, he was just, now he was disciplined. That's one of the things we were told, because of course he was a blabbermouth, right? His entire career, he ran off his mouth like no one you've ever seen. And I've told the story about having lunch with him in 1986 when he came to the Washington Times for an editorial board lunch, and somebody said, how are things going on the Judiciary Committee, when he was the ranking member? And he opened his mouth, and 45 minutes later, he closed his mouth without taking a breath, practically. So that's the real Biden. And then he shows up in the presidential race in 2019 and is answering very clipped in a clipped, abbreviated way at debates. He was not filling his minute. Everybody got a minute and then a minute to whatever, and so it was like.
Right. In normal human interactions, you are not speaking longer than 10 or 15 seconds without checking if people are following or appreciating what you say. Right. Normal, competent human interactions, you're checking in whether your audience is interested, and if you see that they're bored or distracted, right, you shut up. And to just go on and on without respect to the obvious signs of distress or annoyance from your audience is incredible level of obliviousness. Dennis Prager relates that an A-list celebrity invited him to come visit him at his home, and Dennis gets there and visits him, and all the celebrity does is talk about himself for like the next 2 hours.
Like, oh no, he's a new Biden. He's very disciplined now. He knows what he's doing. He's
That was also the first debate was in 2019, right? And that's the one where Jill had to come on stage and lead him off. So the truth is, the signs were there from the.
Well, look, the cast
signs were there from 2015 when he was still vice president, and they were very clear. The signs were blaring. They were honking by 2017.
I can never remember which Castro ran.
Yeah,
aside
one
from
of the
Fidel
two.
in 2020.
They trade off like the Vindmans,
right? So
you never know which one is
right
in which position.
You see, he was already 10. This is before the first primaries. He was 10, 12 points up, and the Democratic Party was already looking at him and saying, he's probably the guy. We better organize a phalanx around him so that nobody talks about this. He's going to be the president.
And another example of this that doesn't have to do with Biden or his cognitive decline or his health, his physical health, the Dr. Jill scandal. When our longtime colleague and friend Joseph.
All right, anyone who wants to be addressed as doctor and they're not a medical doctor, they're violating normal etiquette, and it shows an insecure person. Right? Anyone who's not a medical doctor is not normally described as doctor, and that Dr. Jill wants to be described as Dr. Jill shows you something's wrong there.
Epstein wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal after the election in 2020. And kind of poked fun at the fact that Dr. Jill Biden, who is not a medical doctor, but who holds a EDD, always refers to herself as Dr. Jill in a way to puff up her status. The Team Biden messaging apparatus targeted Joe Epstein, living in Chicago, a bookish intellectual, and tried to cancel him. And it's the same technique. You challenge these.
I tried to book Joe Epstein on this show, couldn't find any email for him, ended up sending a letter, and I got a letter back declining my interview request.
People, and they use their contacts in the media to go after you and gin up your story. And so you saw it there with Dr. Jill, you saw it throughout the presidency. And the other scandal is, as we've already been alluding to, it worked. It worked because of ideological sympathy or partisan affiliation or sheer kind of blockheadedness. The media went along for the ride. And if I may, I have a few excerpts I would just like to read from another book. We've been talking books now. Original Sin comes out tomorrow. But it occurred to me this morning to look at this book. This is The Last Politician by Franklin Foer, one of the Foer.
So Franklin Foer wrote the most respected, most well-reviewed books about the Joe Biden presidency while Joe Biden was still president. And after it became obvious after the 2024 debate between Biden and Trump that Biden was senile much of the time, Franklin Foer did no mea culpa, and Chris Whipple, who also wrote a book about the Biden presidency, did no mea culpa for failing to cover the most obvious story in the world. And there was not one academic expert who pointed out that Joe Biden was obviously unfit for office. Not one. Right? Hundreds said that Donald Trump was not fit for office, but not one pointed out that Biden was not fit for office.
Foer's staff writer for The Atlantic. Book came out in 2023, okay, halfway through.
And Franklin Foer showed zero shame about this.
The term. And I went to the index and I looked up Joe Biden, age. Three appearances, the age. And here's what they are. Page 5. The critique of gerontocracy is that once politicians become senior citizens, they will only focus on the short term because they will only inhabit the short term. But Biden, the oldest president in history, pushed for spending money.
That's not the critique of gerontocracy. The critique of gerontocracy is that as many people age, they become significantly cognitively impaired. What a bizarre summation of what is supposedly the critique of gerontocracy.
On projects that might not come to fruition in his lifetime. His theory of the case compelled him to push for expenditures on unglamorous but essential items, such as the blah, 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 blah. And same thing with Ukraine, whose creative diplomacy, as a result of his gerontocratic status, was able to help us arm Ukraine. Quote, "It was a bravura display of statesmanship." That's the first quote about Biden's age here. Let's see here. The primary, here's 270 talking about the first year in office. Since Ukraine would be among the primary topics, Biden would flash the world a glimpse of his statesmanship, one talking to the public about it. Here's forward. The primary problem with such appearances wasn't Biden's age or acuity. That wasn't the problem.
So Joe Scarborough talks about Joe Biden's unique command of geopolitics and world politics. Show me any example of Joe Biden 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, displaying a unique capacity to pierce to the essence of what's going on in the world. All right. The guy has never been more than a 120 IQ blabbermouth.
It was his indiscipline and imprecision, traits that stalked the entirety of his career. And when he worked his way through the reporter's questions demonstrating his stamina, he couldn't help himself. That's mention number 2. And then finally, 375, the age issue is tackled most directly in The Last Politician. Page 375. For most of his presidency, Democratic voters griped to pollsters about Biden's advanced years. They seemingly preferred a president who projected vigor or who possessed oratorical chops. Silly plebes. Who would want that? Vigor? Oratory? Vox populi. Stupid. Biden's advanced years were a hindrance, Forward concedes, depriving him of the energy to cast.
Right, the cognitive elite, the ruling elite, the dominant elite in the academy and in the media and throughout society kept telling us Joe Biden was fit for office, and ordinary people, ordinary Democrats kept screaming, no, he's not. And the ordinary people were right, and the cognitive elite were wrong.
A robust public presence or the ability to easily conjure a name. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
But, with Ukraine, 376, the advantages of having an older president were on display.
Right. That's what the elite media kept telling us through the Joe Biden presidency. There are many advantages to having an older president. But when it came to Ronald Reagan or to Donald Trump, you don't hear from the elites and from the elite news media about all the advantages of having an older president.
He wasn't just the leader of a coalition. He was the West's father figure. Close quote. Three mentions in this book.
Joe Biden as the West's father figure? What a ludicrous, ridiculous, completely removed from reality assertion.
That was what we were served for 4 years until it became undeniable with that debate. And imagine if that debate had not happened.
Well, and also kind of bizarre given that in his personal family life, if he's so forward looking and worried about his kids and grandkids, he didn't even recognize one of his grandchildren until his hand was forced by the public demanding that he note that his son had had an out of wedlock child who they were pretending didn't exist and trying to pay off. I mean, this is where the Bidens are very keen on invoking personal affection and personal sympathy from the public when it suits them, but then becoming quite brutal and absolutely annihilating, as you say, particularly about Joe. They're political enemies when it suits them, and you can't. I think that's what's crumbled in the public's mind is you cannot do both. If you want our sympathy, then you have to actually behave like a sympathetic figure, particularly in post-presidential life, and he has not done that.
Abe, let me ask you this: 25th Amendment circumstance so that she could rise to the presidency. Imagine, or the cabinet could have done this. It's a complicated procedure.
The fact or the potential here that depending on what everyone in the inner circle knew about his health, about cancer, that had Biden stayed in the election and won, President Kamala was inevitable anyway.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that was the question of the timing of the debate, which I've been contemplating past couple of days. It was the June 22nd debate was extremely early. There was no reason to have that debate at that time. And if you recall, it was Biden who challenged Trump to the debate in that video he released in the spring of last year, of 2024.
With about 15 jump cuts, yes.
Yes, remember, with all the jump cuts. And so you wonder, what was the strategy? What was the theory of the case? You get it out of the way, and so we just showcase him this time, and so if there's any bad effects, then they won't continue. Was there a sense that we need to see if he can perform? Because switching out Biden for Harris was doable.
Astounding.
But this is also why that condescending attitude towards the American people, which the Democratic Party and the media elite have long displayed, came at an exact moment of populist fervor and a candidate in the form of Trump who said, they're out to get me because they hate you. They don't trust you. They think you're stupid, and they're lying to you. It's, fake news this, fake news that. Now, he goes much deeper into his critique of the media. But those two things in combination led a lot of voters who otherwise would not have voted for someone like Donald Trump to put him back in office. And it's understandable. And that's where I think, even if I'm a more traditional conservative, I'm not a populist. So a lot about populism annoys me. But I do understand what that appeal was for a voter who thinks both parties are corrupt, but one party is a lot more corrupt than the other right now because they've been lying to me about what I see with my own eyes.
I continue to think that the key moment in American political life in our lifetime, not maybe in our lifetime, but maybe in the sort of the adult lifetimes of a lot of people who are under 60, was Bill Clinton staring into the camera and saying, I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky, and I did not lie, not one time. That some kind of compact with the American people, the political class and the American people, was broken there. And I still think that, Trump is unimaginable without Clinton, because Trump's personal indiscretions would have rendered him unfit for office, except that 20 years or not quite 20 years earlier, the Democratic Party rallied around somebody who had
and Trump was running against his spouse.
Right, exactly. So
who and it wasn't just the political establishment.
Bill. Yeah.
It was the feminist establishment, and it was Hillary Clinton who was the symbol of that establishment.
Yeah.
That, as a woman, I get to tell you, that's the day feminism died as well.
Among Trump's incredible luck is his luck in enemies,
right,
and opponents.
Well, that is the key to everything. But the reason I bring this up is only to say that Christine talks about the populist moment of that Trump's message resonates and connects. And I think a lot of people think, well, this is really because of Iraq, or, they lied us into Iraq, or Bush, whatever. Then it is about the policy. So Clinton basically stares in the camera, says, I did not have sexual relations. The Democratic Party rallies around him. They defeat efforts to take him down. And then when all is said and done, he acknowledges he did this. He acknowledges he did that. He pays off Paula Jones. I think it just grew and grew and grew. And then Obama says, if you want your doctor, you can keep your doctor.
Right. Often it just doesn't particularly matter if a politician is lying, but the lie with Obamacare, which was a $2 trillion transfer over a decade from productive American citizens to less productive, and destroying the quality of healthcare for productive Americans. All right, this was a crucial and killer lie. Right? Most political lies don't mean anything. All lies are not created equal. All lies are not equally bad. Right? This was a horrible, destructive, awful lie by Obama, that if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor.
And, it's like...
And so the crucial thing here, and I agree with that, but again, if you think just in power terms, what enabled Clinton to muscle through the Lewinsky scandal, what enabled Obama to talk about this is the moment when the seas stop rising. If you like your plan, you keep your plan. 11 times, I don't have the authority to legalize the Dreamers or their relatives, but I'm going to do it anyway after I lose an election in the midterm.
All right, this is the commentary crew the next day, on Tuesday, after Jake Tapper Alex Thompson's book on Biden's decline comes out.
Biden's diagnosis fit right in with his family's mendacity and manipulations. Indeed, it came on the release of the Her tapes, and 2 days before the Tapper-Thompson revelations were set to hit the stands. But if former First Lady Jill Biden imagined that sympathy for her husband's dire condition would upstage, if not put the kibosh on, the depth of the conspiratorial deception, she's in for a rude awakening. Now that members of the press and previous White House staffers are rushing to shove her under the proverbial bus, she's on her own. Still, she might just be flattered by her depiction in Original Sin as the real power in the White House, running the show, if not, heaven forbid, the country, with an iron fist. Okay, so
this White House physician, Kevin O'Connor, who is a longtime Biden family confidant, and we have this story in the Washington Post that we were all laughing about last night, and the headline is "Biden diagnosis draws well wishes, questions, and conspiracy theories." And you're in the conspiracy theory camp, John, you conspiracy theorist, saying they knew, they hid it from us. But I do think the other possibility is that Kevin O'Connor in the White House, he may not have actually been testing Biden for this. He may have been completely negligent. So far as we know, the guy wasn't actually given a cognitive test. That is what Tapper and Thompson report. Now, he didn't need to be given a cognitive test, but
he was
like,
given a
this guy,
cognitive test every single
yeah,
day, every
of
time he
course,
appeared before the
of course,
press.
right? But like, this guy should be subpoenaed and asked questions. What tests were you given, and what tests weren't you given? And he actually may not have been testing this guy for anything, because he didn't want to have to say, if he was asked, that Biden had X, Y, and Z condition. I mean, we just don't know.
Book that he had Spielberg editing his material for a never aired made for video town hall, that his staff used slow motion videos of Biden so people didn't realize how slowly he was walking in real time. And you asked me over text, like, so the NYT and Washington Post wrote about right-wing cheap fakes, and here we had the most expensive fakes in the world going on by the single greatest film director who has ever lived, and still couldn't pull it off.
If you go and look at some of the Biden campaign ads, you can see how much slow motion footage of Biden was used. And that is apparently on Spielberg's guidance to conceal how old he seemed and how slow his movements seemed in real life. Meanwhile, the Washington Post and the New York Times are writing that Republicans are spinning conspiracy theories that make him seem old and demented. Right. And Steven Spielberg's in the White House doing this. So the White House is actually producing expensive fakes, and they're gaslighting the public to say those videos are fake. So my question to John was like, okay, so do we think Katie Glick at the New York Times, who was one of the triple byline authors on that piece, and Tulu Solaranipa at the Washington Post, who wrote that piece about the conspiracy theories, like, will there be any price to be paid for this? And none of them got the story about what was happening inside the White House, about Steven Spielberg going in there and they're trying to produce videos to conceal Biden's old age.
Well, we knew that
and there's no
Spielberg
course
was
correction now when
consulting
this
with them.
medical story comes out. Zero.
Right. So we knew that Spielberg was consulting with them, and that was, of course, considered, wow, that's great. Like, Steven Spielberg's going to help him.
Yeah, Jeffrey Katzenberg was like, holy crap, like, get over there.
Yeah. Yeah, he said gets the best. Like, he's got the best. Who does Trump have? Lee Greenwood. Who does Trump have? Kid Rock. Biden has Steven Spielberg.
I would just suggest that in the future, that should be their attitude toward the president's doctors. He should have the best medical care, not the best filmmakers to hide the fact that he's not getting medical care.
This was the genius of what Trump said yesterday about Biden when he said, I feel so sorry, and it's a terrible thing, but we really need to figure out. He was like, look, I know I was at Walter Reed, right? Because he got COVID, and he was taken to Walter Reed when he nearly died of COVID that week. And he said, I've never seen such good doctors. They have such great doctors at Walter Reed. So I don't know who was actually treating him. I think we need to get to the bottom of this. It was like one of Trump's animal cunning genius statements. Like, he had access to the world's greatest medical care at a drop of a hat. He's the president of the United States. And when Trump needed it, he got it and was saved from COVID. And when Biden got it, he had stage 4 prostate cancer and a 9 Gibson score. The point about the 9 score, I just want to point out, is prostate cancer is, in almost all cases, a very slow-growing cancer. That's why Zeke Emanuel, the oncologist,
So I was commenting on Dan Senor's address to the 92nd Street Y about the state of world Jewry, and you have to ask, in comparison to whom? And overall, Americans, Jews, just have it so good, so blessed in the United States. And that should be the beginning of our understanding of the state of world Jewry, is how blessed we are to be able to live in the United States, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. Bye.